In August of 1989, Bradley spotted what he described as a skinwalker creature while walking home late at night. Bradley's fateful night started simply enough. The then 20-year-old was walking home alone after working a long shift at the Durango, Colorado Rite Aid. He decided to cut through the nearby foothills to save time. Barely halfway through his shortcut, Bradley heard strange noises coming up ahead. What sounded like several people running through the brush. He froze, trying to focus on the sounds while straining his eyes for any movement in the dark. It was then he noticed several shadowy figures darting between the trees about 100 feet ahead of him. Bradley initially assumed they were children playing some sort of game, but very soon realized this was not the case. He could hear them panting heavily, and they were not making any noise while they moved. What's more, he realized that these figures were far too small to be adults. Bradley watched with horror as these creatures began to chase one another around in circles. His mind raced with all manner of explanation for what they might be. Lost hikers, people wearing weird costumes, and even escaped zoo animals. He knew none of these were likely, but was still desperate to come up with some alternatives. As he watched them call to each other in some bizarre language, he began to realize the truth of what he had stumbled onto. He said his first instinct was to run, but before he could, his body locked up and refused to move. His eyes kept darting between the figures as they skittered around in the darkness, their movements getting less coordinated, more erratic with every passing second. Then, one of them walked out from behind a tree just a few feet away from him. Bradley said the figure was nearly 7 feet tall, covered head to toe in dark fur. It had an elongated neck, small beady eyes, and long arms with clawed hands, what looked like a pig's snout. Most terrifying of all, though, were the creature's legs. They bent backwards like a dog or a wolf's hind legs. 2 more creatures stepped out from the shadows behind the first one, circling around Bradley, while he slowly lost control of his body. He said that the only part of him that still worked was his eyesight. All 3 of them stared at him intently as they crept around on their backward bending legs, before finally vanishing into the darkness again. That's when Bradley snapped out of paralysis for good, running as fast as he could, away from the creatures. Bradley claims that he never went back to the foothills again, and started taking a longer route home every single night. He vowed after this to call 911 should these creatures return. Unfortunately, we'll never know if they did. Bradley was killed in a car crash about 7 months later. What makes the Durango case so special, and far more compelling than most others, was Bradley's claim that he had lost control of his body while watching the creatures. He claimed that only part of him that had still moved was his eyes. They kept focusing on different parts of their body as if in a trance-like state. And while we can't say for sure what happened to him exactly, this does bear a strong resemblance to another bizarre phenomenon: alien abductions. If you look at some, though certainly not all reports of alien abduction, there are often mentions of paralysis, or an ability to move freely when whatever it is nearby. The victims may report feeling like they're in a trance or a dream state, and often have a hard time remembering very specific details once they're freed from their paralysis. This is one of many similarities between alien abduction reports and so-called encounters with cryptids. In addition to the loss of free will, another common thread in these stories is an inability to recall specific details right after the encounter. This happens during both types of encounters, but again, it's far more prevalent among those involving possible aliens. It's like some part of their brain blocks out certain information, while whatever it is nearby. Only once it is left can victims remember what happened, if they can at all.
You can call me Derek, and I am a father of 3, living in Highland, Utah. I rent a house here on the outskirts of town. About 50% of my block is undeveloped land, but I live in an area with very little crime, so it is generally safe. I am currently unemployed after being laid off from my job as a machinist. I had been working 6 days a week for 6 months straight. I was. and still am doing what I can to save up enough money for a cross-country move. I like getting out of the house and exploring the land around me. The undeveloped parts are perfect for this. It is quiet and secluded. I can go out there with my friends, my kids, or on my own with no real worry of anything happening. My wife stays at home since she is now expecting our 4th child. She enjoys plants and gardening, so she spends a lot of time in our backyard with those activities. I want to make sure they are safe. I wanted a job that would keep me busy and be fulfilling, but my wife and I agree that it is more important to be home with the kids right now while we're about to have another. The day before my neighbor called me, things were no different than usual. I was up early and had breakfast while my wife fed the kids. I went out to enjoy some fresh air while they were busy. It was a lovely day to sit out on the porch and enjoy the weather. I stayed out there for an hour or two before my wife came out to join me with a cup of coffee. We stayed out there until the kids were done with their breakfasts, and then we went in to give them their baths. My neighbor was outside too, looking a little nervous. He called me over to speak to him. He began telling me if I saw the shape last night by the backside of our house. I asked him what he was talking about. I wasn't sure. He began to tell me he saw a tall, upright walking coyote trying to open the back door to our house last night. He said he yelled at it and scared it off. He was asking me why would this animal be trying to break into my house. He told me to be careful. Later that night, I was up late, reading a good book, actually. It was after midnight and I think just about everyone else was asleep by this point. I was the only one awake. I began to hear scratching on the outside of the house. I had completely forgotten what my neighbor had told me at this point. I got up and went to see where the noise was coming from. As I made my way downstairs, the sounds were getting louder. I slowly crept down the stairs to where the noises were. They stopped as I reached the bottom steps. I turned on the lights, but didn't see anything outside the sliding glass door. I walked over to the sliding glass door and turned the outside porch light on. Nothing. However, off a little ways, I see a tall silhouette of a figure. It took me a second to realize it was the coyote. It was larger than what I had initially thought. It began to walk towards the light. I could clearly make out its legs, arms, and head from the light of the outside porch. It walked very slowly, almost like it was taunting me. It stopped once it reached the porch light. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like an upright man, but it had the head of a coyote. I stood there, frozen in shock and fear. I didn't know what to do. We had a dog, but he was sleeping inside and couldn't help me. I thought about getting my wife's gun, but by the time I could have got it, this thing would have already been through our sliding glass doors. The coyote man looked at me and just stared. It then, very slowly, turned around and walked back away from the light and disappeared. I was too scared to even move. I waited until I saw it leave my yard and contemplated calling the police. I realized what good that would even do. A coyote is trying to break into my place. That's a quick way to sound crazy. I sat down on the couch and simply waited until morning light. My wife was wondering why I was sleeping on the couch. I didn't tell her. I didn't want to scare her. I spoke to the neighbor that same day and told him what I saw. That's when he got really pale and began telling me about skinwalkers, something I had never heard of until this very point. He explained to me they are evil beings. They will shapeshift to animals like coyotes or deer and perform acts of evil. It was after this that I started lining my house with salts and burning sage. I wasn't going to take any chances. After this, I stopped having issues and this thing never showed back up. We ended up moving from that house about a year after to Southern California. I haven't looked back since.
In the spring of 1996, Sarah, while visiting family close to the Navajo reservation, had a sighting of what she swears is the infamous Navajo skinwalker. And this is her eyewitness account that she shared. I was driving back to my aunt's house. It was maybe 11 or 12 at night. As I approached the road that leads into the town, there is a dirt road that turns off to your left that goes up this small hill and skirts by these railroad tracks. There is no crossing in the area. There is a forest all along this road, and behind it. As I was approaching this dirt turnoff, coming down the main dirt road, which has houses sporadically placed down the stretch of road, but they are far apart. You can see pretty much everything for quite some distance, until it drops out of sight, where the hill begins to rise. I had just come over one of these hills when I saw something move on this stretch of road, and as I came over the next hill, I saw two very tall beings, both stooped over, walking across the road. They were too tall to be a man, and they moved like apes do when they walk, on all fours, but these were upright. Their upper bodies were more muscular than anything else, and it seemed like their shoulders were almost touching as they walked. I slammed on the brakes, threw open the door, intending to yell at them because you just don't see anything like that around here. I thought they were two very large drunk men, almost getting hit by my truck. But they were very fast and disappeared into the heavy thicket of woods that are down along the stretch of road. Being from around here, you hear stories of the skinwalker and whatnot, but I'm pretty sure this was something else. Maybe it was a skinwalker. Whatever it was, wasn't human.
I'm not sure if this belongs in this sub, or where I should repost it, just looking for some guidance. Not sure what is going on. I live in the suburbs in Arizona, right by a mountain preserve. There are plenty of washes around. We get coyotes, bobcats, raccoons, the usual. We have plenty of chickens and 5 dogs. 1 wolf dog, 1 big male Akita, 3 Anatolian shepherds, 2 are male puppies though. The dogs are inside dogs, but we let them into the yard and they have free roam. We have a 6-foot wall around a large yard. We have neighbors on all 3 sides of the wall. One of the houses to the side is vacant, and the one directly behind us, the owner hasn't been home for about a month. On both sides of his house is a wash. About a week ago at dusk, my sister had called for all the dogs to come inside. She saw one of the pups walking away from her and into some bushes out of sight and called to it. I asked her what she was calling to, and she said the pup. I said no, he's right here. Which he was. All the dogs were accounted for. We just brushed it off as strange but didn't think much of it. Last night, around 12:30 at night, my father and I are awake in the family room. We hear a large bang from outside, which sounds like a trash can lid closing. So we send out the Akita, and we grab lights and head outside. We check the trash cans. Nothing is disturbed as far as we can tell. I notice my sister has come to the door because she heard the bang too. I head back in to talk to her, when my dad pops his head in and asks if we let out the puppies. We say no, and he gets mad and responds that he's right there outside. The Akita we let outside is standing next to my father. Our 4 other dogs are laying right inside. We watch as what is not our pup, but looks like his backside, walk behind our greenhouse and out of sight. The same dog that my sister had seen the other day. Same size, same color, same curly tail. Both times, we only saw its backside. There's no chance this breed is running wild in Arizona. That pup has also recently gotten a scar across his muzzle, but we thought it was from the other dogs picking on him more than usual lately. He is also the only dog that barks at his reflection at night in the windows. Our dogs usually run around the yard day or night playing. In the past few days they have been hanging around the door while they are outside, or around us when we go outside. They have been uncomfortable recently, which is weird for them. The 5 together in the yard fear nothing. The smallest are literally the 2 male puppies weighing in at 70 pounds each. What we saw looked exactly like him. At least what we saw, which was his backside. We didn't follow because of everything I read on these subs say not to. And not knowing what it was, I wasn't about to take that chance without some guidance. There is no chance this is a wild dog hopping our 6-foot fence. There are no wild Anatolian shepherds in the area. It's more of a rare breed. Any thoughts on what it could be or what it wants? Also, side note, we usually don't hear other dogs barking at night. We've heard more than ever recently, but only on days that we have not seen the dog.
I had worked a long day at a restaurant and decided to go outside for a smoke before bed. The night was clear with the stars shining brightly. I took a seat on my outdoor steps and lit up a cigarette, looking at the wonderful stars as I did so. Out here in Boulder, Colorado, the sky is just so perfect. After about 10 or so minutes, I was ready to go back inside. So I stood up, going back inside and thinking nothing, After going back inside and laying down for bed, I fell asleep. The next thing, after about maybe an hour or so in bed, I'm staring at the ceiling and suddenly, jolted by a very loud tapping sound coming from the front door. Immediately, I sit up, staring at the door while listening to the noise continue for what seemed like forever. It finally stopped. However, when the noise returned, it went from a tapping noise to sounding like something was slithering underneath my house. I got out of bed and peered out my sliding glass doors, which lead to my deck outside. I could see if there was anything near my house, but all I saw were the clean white stairs leading down to my yard. I decided to have a better look, thinking maybe I was just dreaming it. So I stepped out onto the hard concrete of my porch, looking around for anything strange. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I began to feel silly for even suspecting that something was wrong, and thinking, okay, I must have just had a really long, hard day. But at one moment, I realized I actually did see something. What appeared to be eyes, shining through the darkness. I squinted at this thing in hopes that it would reveal itself as something familiar. But instead, my heart sank as I realized what it was. What I saw was a large, upright coyote, massive in build, easily the largest I'd ever seen in my life, with these glowing yellow eyes, walking my direction. I was petrified, so I ran back in the house, locked the doors, and grabbed my fire axe, ready for action. But this thing, when I looked outside the window, was now gone. I didn't see anything anymore, but I was expecting it to come back. Maybe it had only been a few moments, but I swear, I heard that thing coming back. It was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked over, towards the direction I originally saw the eyes, and it seemed like this thing was moving quickly, moving in my direction but kind of acting weird, like a drunken man would, staggering and kind of wavering. That's when I heard this loud, deep screech that was coming from down the canyon. I can only assume that there were more of these things, and that this being or creature or animal was not acting alone. I've heard of the tales of skinwalkers and things like that, but I never actually wanted to admit or believe they're real. After this night, my opinion on them has permanently changed.
Story 3. Strange encounter at night. Just a little context about myself. I live in Southern California near the Mojave Desert. Beyond our backyard is an open desert which is home to coyotes. We never had any problem with coyotes, and we have a brick wall as a fence in our backyard. Also, I believe it when I see a type of person. I haven't really put much thought about skinwalkers until fairly recently, thanks to all these TikTok videos that only come at night. Last night, I had a weird encounter when I had to let my dog out to pee. It was about 3 a.m. in the morning, and as usual after I let her out I go back to my room and wait for her to bark to be let back in. After about 15 or so minutes, I hear her barking heavily outside. As I went to go check it out, I made a crucial mistake and whistled, as that's how I get her attention, and signal her to go back in. She's usually pretty obedient and listens to me, but this time she just wouldn't budge, and kept on barking at the corner of our backyard. So I went and investigated what it is she's barking at, and that's when I heard an owl hoot. Pretty normal so far, as she's usually easily timid when it comes to noises. As I tried to grab her, that's when I thought I heard a person's voice say, "Hey," which got me shook, but then I told myself maybe it was just an owl hooting. I went ahead and continued to try and grab my dog, but she ran the opposite way, and this time I heard a very weird like mimic of an owl hooting but mixed with a deep human voice. The first thing on my mind was I need to go back inside, grab a gun because maybe someone is trying to rob me. But then I also didn't want to leave my dog behind, and it's very unlikely that they'll be able to scale the fence that easily. Now, at this time is when I noticed the air smelled like a pile of meat was left under the sun for days, mixed with some rotting food. Then, all the skinwalker videos from TikTok came rushing into my head, and I wondered maybe I'm overthinking. So, I told myself, okay, if this is my time, this is my time to go. But I have to grab my dog before I go back inside. Also during this time, the mimic owl hooting is getting faster and eventually, finally started to sound like an actual owl hooting. I don't know why, but this kinda gave me closure that maybe I was overthinking it. I was able to finally grab my dog, and I rushed inside, locked the door, and went to grab a gun and an emergency flashlight. As I went back outside, I can still smell but very faintly that rotten egg and meat smell. The hooting finally stopped, checked the corner, and didn't find anything. After being outside for about 5 to 10 minutes, I decided maybe I am still half asleep. As I was walking back to go inside the house, I glanced once more time at the corner, and I'll never forget how bright the eyes were of the owl staring back at me, and the ominous vibe it was giving. I quickly turned my eyes away and went inside the house, locked all the doors, and closed the curtains. I am not 100% sure what I heard in last night, but as I was inspecting the sand from outside of the fence this morning, I didn't see any footprints of any kind. So, for now I am hoping that maybe it was just a regular owl with throat problems. But I could never forget those ominous bright yellow eyes.
Towards the end of my time living at the base, I had a very creepy experience. At least, I think it was creepy. I actually don't know what to think about it, so that's why I'm typing this out, instead of just keeping it in my head. It can't possibly be real, can it? That's how I feel every day. I'm sure there's people out there who will say I'm making this up. This is why I've remained quiet about it for so long. Anyway, there were 2 other guys with me when we saw something skin-crawlingly creepy happen in our room one night, right around 3 or 4 in the morning. I know that's technically morning, early morning, but whatever. We were sleeping, and we heard somebody open our door and shut it. Being the curious crew we were, we all got up to see what was going on. Off in the distance, we noticed this large black figure. It resembled a large black wolf. It was kind of darting back and forth in the darkness. It made me feel a bit uneasy, since I tried to play it off as a large dog, but everything about it just screamed wrong. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, this was in South Carolina. Now, I should also make note that when I grew up in a house that was supposedly very haunted. I've had all sorts of weird things happen to me. Cupboards opening and closing. Cups and plates flying across the rooms. You know, all that typical ghost stuff. But I'd never been more scared than I had in that moment. Actually seeing something, in the flesh, moving, and very large. One of our guys who was in the crew was really into occultism and black magic. He was always playing Magic the Gathering, which, you know, is some sort of card game meant for people who are into that. He wasn't scared at all, but more fascinated. He kept telling us, we can control them, we can do things with them, and I just thought he was pranking and trying to scare us. But now, I think as crazy as he was serious. I told everybody else what was going on, as if they didn't already know at this point. We just tried to stay inside and be quiet, in hopes that it would not come back. It sounded like it tried to get in the house multiple times, at least opening and closing the door. I'm not sure why it ever came in. Maybe it was testing the weakness of the doors and casing the house. I'm not too sure, but that's the only night in my life where I've ever encountered such a thing before.
Story 4. The English Skinwalker. To this day, I still don't know what happened or how to explain it. I live in Yorkshire, England, which, in some places, is a very green area with loads of trees and hills, etc., where I lived as a child growing up. I lived relatively close to a woodland area with roughly 5 to 10 miles of woodland. Now, as a kid, this was amazing with my friends, as we could play hide and seek, or build tree houses and forts for hours. So, I was never scared of it with or without friends. On one situation, I was walking in the woods when I was around 8 alone. I remember it being dark, but only around 4 or 5 p.m., so it must have been the winter season. My friends and I had been working on a fort, and I was collecting sticks for it in my spare time, as I was really devoted to it. Fun fact, when I went to visit my hometown last year, the fort was still there, just looking extremely abandoned with old cans and crisp packets on the floor. I knew roughly where I was, but wasn't too sure, when I found a weird formation of rocks. It didn't mean anything to me, as me and my friends made things like this, but this was not us and it was definitely man-made. I decided to stay around the area because I didn't want to get lost. After 2 or 3 trips back from there to our fort, I noticed a deer in the woods. My dad had told me there was deers and foxes in the woods, but uncommon to see. I was so excited, so I followed it. Now, looking back on it, it moved very unnaturally, with it almost jumping and skipping like it was brand new to walking on 4 legs. As a kid, I didn't think anything because I'd never seen a deer before, so I didn't know how they moved. A couple minutes after following it, I fell over a rock and made a huge crunch on some sticks. The deer froze. It slowly turned around and stared in my direction, so I slowly got back up and stared at it behind a tree. It sniffed around the stones and suddenly stared at me. I'd say it was like around 100 to 150 feet away from me, so I got scared and ran away. I ran for a minute or two until I caught my breath. I remember I had a mixture of excitement, but also nervousness. I turned around to look back at the direction I ran, and, to my surprise, the deer was there, staring at me. I hadn't heard anything follow me or anything. This really freaked me out, so, out of pure terror, I run back out of the forest and didn't stop until I was safely out. The entrance to the woods where I got in and out was down a steep hill, so I got to the bottom onto the street and stared back up. My heart was racing, and there it was still looking out of the woods at me. It terrified me, and still to this day I can still remember the chill that went down my spine. I was so scared I started crying when all I heard was "don't." I looked around and no one was there. Then I heard "come back please" in an almost human voice. I could make out the words, but it sounded almost inaudible, like an old radio. I ran back to my house and cried to my mom and dad, but they didn't know what to say. I had nightmares but still couldn't figure it out. I didn't go into that woods for a good couple months until I started going back with my friends again. The woods gave me a chill, but I never had an experience like that again. I only realized what it could have been after reading up on skinwalkers a couple years back with me connecting the dots. I'm sure it was a skinwalker. I'm happy I ran, and I'm happy I didn't stay, but I'll never know what could have happened if I went back in.
If you enjoy these stories, be sure to hit that big old red subscribe button for more original horror stories, cryptid encounters, and compilations. Working as a ranger is never an easy job. Sometimes, it can be more demanding than other times. Working closely as search and rescue to find missing hikers or potentially deceased individuals who lost their way. But today, I'm not going to share you a story about one of those times. Instead, I want to share with you a story about one that I believe has to do with supernatural occurrences, specifically the occult. Now, this is just my speculation. I cannot be 100% certain. That's part of the reason I'm writing this story down, to tell you, and you can come to your own conclusions based on what happened. Anyway, this is my narrative. It was late afternoon, and I'm in a park located in Colorado, the name that I will not mention. After checking to make sure everybody was cleared out of the restrooms, since we were doing some reconstruction on them, I began hearing my name being called from the woods. I thought that was odd, because the name was coming from my ex-wife, the voice of my ex-wife. She had passed away 4 years prior, and divorced roughly 11 years before. Our marriage was very tumultuous and toxic. 7 years of hell. It didn't start off that way, but it soon turned into that, when she got infatuated with a man she met online. Anyway, I'm gonna spare you my life drama. The point is it should have been impossible for me to be hearing this dead woman's voice coming from the woods not far away. And the second I heard her voice, those memories came rushing back to me. Memories filled with restless nights, violence, and emotional distress. I called out to her, calling her name, but there was no response. Only my name being called a second time. And I bet you're screaming at me. What did I do next? Probably the biggest mistake that I've made. I followed the voice, thinking that it was somebody pranking me or coming up with some sort of reason to lure me in the woods. I was armed, so I wasn't too afraid, and it's not like it was nighttime. It was daylight. Overcast, actually, providing enough visibility that if I were to find myself in somewhat of a sticky situation, I was confident I could get myself out of it. So, I moved quickly and investigated properly, like I should have. I would call out my ex-wife's name. I would call out any name out of desperation, just to get a response, to know that I was not crazy. However, any time that I called out for a name, it was met with silence, and I was finding myself wandering off more and more, when maybe about 20 minutes goes by, and I'm following this voice which is leading me deeper and deeper in the woods, till I come upon a very, very small clearing. It's what's in this clearing that had me deeply disturbed, and the reason why I believe this was some sort of occultic ritual or something. In this small clearing is a circle made out of bones, but not just any kind of bones, certainly not human bones, but deer bones. Somebody had somehow managed to create a very, very neat circle, near perfect, out of different bones from a dead deer. Several dead deers, actually. I estimate them being bones of a deer, judging by their size, and I've seen many, with a small pile of deer skulls in the very center of the circle. Man, I'll tell you what, as soon as I stepped by and saw that circle of bones, I got a really, really bad feeling in my stomach, like I needed to leave and get out of there right this instant, or something very bad was about to happen. I did not want to stick around to find out. Before I could even turn around in the opposite direction to leave, I heard the voice calling out further, "Don't go." Only this time, changing from my ex-wife's voice to a deeper, raspier one. I knew that now was the time that I needed to head back more than ever and alert my supervisors of what was taking place. My boss kind of made fun of me, asking me why I was so pale and shook up. I sat down in his chair in his office and explained to him, looking him dead in the eye, exactly what I heard, what I did, and what I found in the clearing. He stared at me, blankly for several seconds, before erupting in laughter, telling me it was probably a prank. Either that or maybe I'm overly stressed and not getting enough sleep, and I'm hearing things. As for what was in the clearing, it's more than likely some sort of prank or something somebody did, and he hardly has any doubt it's anything related to satanic panic. But he would have somebody go and check it out, just to make sure. He even was kind enough, if you call it kind, to let me have the rest of the evening off. Well, the next morning, he pulls me aside and lets me know that one of his team members went and checked it out, and they cleaned it up. He gave me very little information, and the information he gave me was very vague and giving me no concrete answers at all. Now listen to me. I know what I heard. I'm not crazy. I do not have any history of mental illness, or hearing voices, schizophrenia, none of that. What I heard is something that doesn't make sense to me. It bothers me to this day. What was that clearing, and why was there a circle of bones? Who made it and why? And more importantly, who or what was trying to lure me? I feel like my gut instincts were trying to tell me that day that I was probably about to be killed or sacrificed had I stuck around longer. Just my 2 cents, but I can't help but feel how accurate my speculations are. What do you think? I've been working in and out of search and rescue for the past 6 years now. While I've truly come across some heartbreaking things, like children and the elderly, for example, I've also come across some very disturbing cases of deceased ones, and I'm going to share one with you today. The day itself was pretty standard. We had received a call later on in the evening about a man who had been gone missing in the morning. We had begun our search, did not find him or any trace of him in the immediate area. Once we got involved, we upped our search to the next tier. However, it was not until the following evening, right around 5 or 6 p.m., that his body had been found. He was 4 miles away from where he had last been seen, and his body was found 80 feet up in a large branch in a pine tree. Not only is the way he was found disturbing, but the location and how far up this tree he was found is also equally disturbing. When his body was successfully pulled down, he was missing his shoes. All the rest of his clothes were completely intact. They weren't even dirty or scratched, like they would be if this man had maniacally walked 4 miles and climbed this high up a pine tree. It looked as if something had picked him up and dropped him off, with the way he was hanging on the branch. He had been dead rather recently, his blood just barely coagulating, and the look on his face was pure terror. Once the coroner examined and worked on his body, it was concluded that the man had died from exposure. There had been no questions answered about how he had got up there, why he was 4 miles away, completely off trail in the opposite direction of where he told his friends and family he was going to be headed, where his shoes were, and why none of his clothes were dirty or scratched up. The other strange and disturbing detail is his tongue had been cut out. Not ripped out or sawed out, but almost surgically cut. And upon hearing about it, it was not seared like with a laser. It was used by a very, very sharp knife, like a scalpel. Surgical precision is what the coroner had told me. But what's weird is there were no blood. As I stated when I initially opened up this letter, I've done all sorts of search and rescue operations, from children to adults and elderly, some very tragic, and some with happy endings. And then you get those that are bizarre and strange, and like this one, downright terrifying. It was after this, actually, that I kind of got turned on to David Paulides and his entire Missing 411 series. Unfortunately, that just opened a can of worms for me. As I began reading many of those, I realize I'm not alone, and these sorts of things are happening all over the country, especially considering that I had my own experience. I was never told, though, by supervisors or threatened to not share any information about it. And I will say that no, I've never encountered, seen, or heard about any staircases in the middle of the woods. But finding people who have disappeared and reappeared under mysterious, eerie circumstances does not sit right with me. I don't anymore, but for a while there, I used to work as a park ranger in Northern California, and I'll never forget the one morning where I got a call from a very angry older man and told me that he was upset because last night, at about 2 a.m, this huge hairy man was banging on his door on his small RV camper, and I had to explain to him that there were no other people around his RV site, since this old man was convinced that it was one of the tent campers nearby trying to start trouble. I think a bunch of college kids, but there was nobody around. And by the descriptions he gave, that screamed Bigfoot to me. I acknowledge and know that Bigfoot exists. He would not be the first one to acknowledge such sightings within the park. We've had many others like him, but I want to keep this very linear and straight to the story. I humored him and went out there to check it out. On the back portion of his RV, he had a massive dent, which appeared to be something rather large either kicked it or punched a dent into it. He was telling me he thinks a large buck walked by and for whatever reason kicked his trailer. I asked him if he felt it or if he woke up to this. He said that him and his wife were fast asleep. They never heard anything other than the loud banging on the door, where he peeped out the window, grabbed his shotgun, and saw what he thought was a large hairy man trying to get in his trailer. He screamed at him, threatening it to shoot if this thing did not back away, which then very quickly disappeared. He said the next thing he does is he wakes up in the morning and finds this massive dent on the back of his RV, and came to complain to us about it, along with the banging, thinking that it was a rowdy teenager or someone trying to cause trouble. I had to sit him down and explain to him if he had ever heard of Bigfoot, but he would not hear me out. He thought the idea was absolutely preposterous, and while it probably was not appropriate for me as a professional ranger to talk to him about Bigfoot, I couldn't help but personally warn him and explain to him that no camper was going to do this. This was something from something else, and we had already received a bunch of calls about these kinds of things prior. In fact, about 2 weeks before this, a camper A friendly older lady had also complained about a rotten stench filling up her campsite at night. She claimed it smelled like sulfur and rotting eggs, while another newlywed couple had saw a large pair of eyes staring at them through the trees. Honestly, I could go on with all the things I've heard, but I'm very much a believer, and I know for a fact there are several Sasquatch that roam that campsite. I don't know if it's the food, I don't know what. They're not attacking people or killing anybody. Nothing like that, but they're definitely trying to not make themselves too known. Maybe they're pissed that this campground is on a part of their territory. I've heard things from a few natives that have camped here, but nothing enough that I can consider myself educated on the subject. Anyhow, I just thought you'd like this information. Feel free to read it to your viewers. Or do whatever you want with it. I don't care. Anyway, have a wonderful day. I was out with a fellow colleague ranger, assessing portions of the trail, things that needed proper maintenance, and redoing and creating protocols to take care of certain things. We made it to one of the trail loops, where we stopped for a second, looking at our maps and assessing the closest location to us via GPS coordinates. When a hiker approaches us, he seems very sweaty, red-faced and panicked, gibbering and stumbling and fumbling over his words about something. We hold his shoulder, look him straight in the eye, and tell him to calm down and calmly tell us what he needed to tell us. He stops, closes his eyes, and calmly explains that he was just followed by what he explains to be a large, hairy, upright bear. My colleague and I kind of retract physically, look at each other, giving each other that look like, what is this guy on? So we look back at him, and you could tell he's embarrassed, almost a hint of feeling ashamed. We ask him if he can elaborate a little more. He explains that he was just about a mile or so down the trail. The same trail that if my colleague and I were to continue to go on, we would hit the same spot he's talking about. It's a sharp bend in the trail. He explains to us that this large, hairy bear that stood upright, that had a flat human face, was watching him and nearly reached out to try and grab him. The hiker, being so incredibly frightened, nearly ran the rest of the way until he saw us and slowly approached. My colleague and I were so busy, we did not see him. Now, I want to take a moment here to say that I don't believe he was making it up. Unless he was the world's best actor, but that would not explain his heavy, labored breathing, and the fact he acted so fidgety and nervous. Something had happened to him. Unless the man was stashing and hiding drugs, but why would he come to us about something so ridiculous? I looked at my partner once again. We told him we would go check it out. We told him to go stay safe and head back to camp. That's already where he was going. As soon as the hiker walked away, I whispered to him, "Was that guy crazy? Or did something really happen?" But then my partner surprised me. He shot me a look that said everything I needed to know. Apparently, my colleague knew what he was talking about. I could tell that by the expression he clearly wore on his face, and he said, "We're not going to be checking out anything. We don't ask questions, we leave it alone." Now, he had been doing this job for many more years than I have, and I guess I was just naive and ignorant to this. He immediately cut me off mid-sentence as I was trying to ask him, and now, his entire demeanor and tone had changed from friendly and warming to cold, stern, and very serious, almost with a command in his voice, telling us our next GPS coordinates, when before, he was just asking me what I prefer our best course of action could be. In that moment, I tried to brush it off and just play along with it. Clearly, this topic had somehow struck a chord with him, and things were not looking good. I brushed it off and continued to try and do my job properly. Later on that evening, though, once the dust was settled, so to speak, I wanted answers. What happened earlier was not good enough to quench my thirst. Later on that evening, after the dust had settled, so to speak, I sought a few minutes with my boss. As soon as I had sat down in his office, we began to speak on it. Before I could even finish the entirety of my sentence, he cuts me off and immediately sticks his finger up to my face and tells me in the most serious, nasty tone I've ever heard him speak. There are things we don't discuss. This is one of them. If you value your employment and your career, I suggest you forget about it. Let bygones be bygones. Now, get out of my office. We are no longer discussing it. And he showed me the door. I was utterly speechless. I'd never seen him react that way before, but clearly, after this display from him and my fellow colleague, I knew something was going on. I don't want to get all tinfoil hat on you here, but I feel like there's some sort of hidden information, perhaps a conspiracy about something going on. I don't necessarily believe the Bigfoot idea, but it is very strange to me that this poor hiker, somebody who I can't really envision going through all the length to make something up, wasting his own time, and putting on a fake performance for us, when why? What is he getting out of it? And then to have the colleague and my boss act this way, it just doesn't make any sense. I should also state that I've had no personal strange encounters or experiences while in this career field, and I hope I don't ever. But it all just feels forced. It feels fake. There's something up, and I really want to get to the bottom of it. We had received a call about a large black bear by one of the campsites. Me and my supervisor got into our ATV and drove out to the area of the campsite. After speaking with one of the residents there at the camp, they informed us that the shape they thought was a black bear was right over in that section of trees, right next to the large meadow. This was only about 100 to 150 feet away from their campsite. We investigated, thinking we would see bear tracks and scat, all telltale signs of a large black bear. But what we did not expect to find were large humanoid tracks, bipedal, easily 18 inches in length, and 7 to 8 inches in width. After searching past the trees, we didn't see any signs of scat or anything that would point to a large black bear. However, in the meadow over, we found a lot of blood, followed by a large deer that was ripped in half. Around this deer were large feet prints, bipedal, given in the dimensions I just told you. These led off deeper into the woods. And while I'm a big Bigfoot skeptic, I couldn't help but acknowledge what was present here at this time. Evidence and the signs before us were certainly now not pointing at all to a large black bear, like we had initially thought. Instead, something much, much different. My supervisor alerted me. We were going to have to wrap things up here. We could not let this go on. We were going to have to evacuate this part of the campground. My supervisor got on the phone with somebody I did not recognize. He spoke very quietly and talked very aggressively, like there was an argument. Later that evening, after getting back to the main portion of the station and relocating the other campers to different camping spots, we had a few different men come in that looked like they were from the government. They flashed their badges and told me they had wanted to speak privately with my supervisor. About 20 to 25 minutes later, both of them come out of the office. They leave, and my supervisor just looks at me blankly and pulls me over and explains, I'm going to have to take about a week off. They're going to have to reorder some of the staffing personnel here at this park. I'd been here long enough to not ask questions. It's just for the better. So I accepted it. He explained to me that it's a week of paid leave. After I came back about a week later, things were just not the same. 4 rangers were now gone. They were no longer employed, and that portion of the park, where the quote-unquote large black bear had been sighted, was now closed indefinitely. There were also strange men coming and going throughout the park, who looked like they were part of the Secret Service. We were not allowed to ask questions. We were not allowed to speak about it. And as far as I know, whatever that became, they handled it whatever way they handled it. I'm only telling you what I know, which unfortunately... This is a story that I know about the time a Windigo had visited the reservation. This happened a few years ago, around 10 at night. I lived by myself, and I was getting ready for bed. I turned out the lights and was beginning to lie down. I thought I heard some scratches on my window. I had just lifted my head and looked at the window to see nothing. About a couple of minutes later, I hear it again, but it was louder this time. I spooked. I jumped out of bed and got to go see what it was. Me being a lazy idiot, I didn't bother to turn on the lights in case it was nothing. I just used the light from my phone. I looked at my window. Nothing again. Then I hear a knocking on the window in the next room over. I think, what the? And walk to the room where I hear it coming from. Nothing again. I go to lay down and hear a bang on the roof. It sounded like something big jumped up there. The footsteps banging on the roof, walking to where my room is. And then it just stops. So I lay there and listen to whatever it is going on. And now it was dead quiet. I don't know why, but I got the idea that if I knock on my wall, it would go away, thinking it was somebody running from the police. I knock on the wall, and I knocked back on the roof. I yelled at it to get off my house. This is private property. It began to bang on the roof and window at the same time. I jumped up, grabbed my 9mm, still using the light on my phone, pointing my pistol at the window, yelling to just leave. Then, it jumps down and started hitting my window. I froze there with my pistol. I looked out the window to only see a 7-foot-tall figure, and from what little I can see, I snapped out of it, ran to the front room. It around my house, scratching the wall as it made its way to the front. By then, the neighbors' dogs must have saw it. They started losing it, barking and howling like I've never heard before. Then, whatever it was began to leave, running up the road, making a strange howling noise. It made me want to piss myself. And then it was gone, running a few miles up my grandparents' house, jumping and running on everybody's roof, howling like crazy. Somebody called the police, and when one arrived, the thing ran in front of his car. The police officer froze staring at it. It was this 7-foot-tall, skinny black figure with what looked to be a deer head. The thing had blood on its hands and seemed not so interested in the officer. The thing then ran at high speed to the woods, never seeing it again. It seemed the blood on the thing's hand was a visitor that was attacked while camping on the powwow grounds. She was at a party when she thought she could just walk back to her campsite and sleep, when, as she said, a large figure began to chase her. It scratched her on the back of the leg, making her fall down. Her cuts and gashes were deep. She began to scream in pain and looked up at the thing, but it was now gone. The scream of the lady was heard from security patrolling the powwow grounds. Nobody knows what it was. Some say it was a Windigo that came in with the visitors coming to see the powwow. I have no idea what that was, but it's not going to be the last strange thing that happens at the Mystery Ranch. My friend and I were on a 40-plus hour road trip across the country. We got to talking about glitches in the Matrix and the Mandela effect. We're both from the universe before the switch. You know, J.C. Penney without the extra E, Karate Kid with the red headband, etc. But we never thought we'd experience a real-time glitch for ourselves, not even an hour after. It's me, my friend and her teenage daughter, and her daughter's boyfriend. We're hauling horses 1,500 miles across the U.S. So, when stopped this particular time, my friend and her daughter ran into pee while I decided to check on the ponies. I also really had to pee. So, I made sure they were standing, filled with their water, and headed to the door. I noticed a mom and her young son making their way to the door at about the same pace as myself. I remember thinking, oh no, they're probably heading to the bathroom as well. And if it's small, I'll probably have to wait. Should I try to run ahead? Nah, the little boy may have to go just as badly as I do. I held the door open for them, and just as I figured, they make a beeline for the bathroom. I follow, and just as they open the bathroom door, my friend is now standing there, also reaching for the door. They do the little awkward dance to get around each other. Mom and son make a left inside the door, and I step back to let my girlfriend out. I give her a dumb line like, "No, fancy meeting you here," or something, and walk in after them. The bathroom was small, only 2 stalls, and about enough space for one person to stand inside the door and wait. Both stalls were closed, so that's what I did. Right when you walk in, there was a small stall straight ahead, the handicap stall on the left, where I assumed the mom and son went, and the sink directly on the right. You could reach out your arms and touch them all in the space I was standing. As I was waiting, I noted how quiet it was. Not a lot of shuffling like you might hear if 2 people were navigating the same bathroom stall, nor any talking actually. Maybe mom and son just knew the routine and didn't talk much. The stall in front of me finally opened, and a young girl came out. I quickly rushed in. The toilet sat directly in the middle of the crack between the door and the wall. Great. That meant I could see the door and almost the entire bathroom. I heard the handicap door open, and out walks my friend's daughter. If she was in the handicap stall, where were the mom and son? They definitely did not walk past me. I would have noticed if they walked out after me. I sat down. I finished up and walked out of the bathroom, scanning the small gas station and parking lot for them. Nothing. I don't know what kind of car they got out of, so I don't know if they're still here. I went back to see if there was maybe a family bathroom door close to the woman's, that they had somehow walked back without me noticing and rushing into the family bathroom or something. But there wasn't. I'd asked my friend if she remembered the lady that almost ran into her in the bathroom. She did, so I know that part was real. Now, I asked her if she remembered seeing where she went after she walked in. She couldn't remember. I know this isn't overly scary, or really all that interesting, but it's hurting my head to think about. I cannot figure out where they would have gone, or if perhaps this really was a true glitch in the Matrix. Me and my friends were a little group of paranormal investigators that lived in a town called Nixon. The town was about 7 miles away from the town of Fort Clover and the Mystery Ranch. Everyone in Nixon tries to visit the ranch, only to be stopped by the ranch's private security. They threaten to shoot anybody who trespasses on the property. Here's our story of what my little team experienced on our visit to Fort Clover. My name is David. I'm 21. I joined this team of mystery detectives with a couple of friends that I know. Their names are Katie, who's 19, Jacob, who's 22, Sam, who's 21, and Evie, who's 19. We are a group of friends that got the idea of being paranormal investigators from this TV show, Paranormal Busters. The show is about 3 guys essentially that try to go out and debunk fake videos by staying at that haunted place for the night. We thought, let's go to Fort Clover, sneak into the Mystery Ranch. Sam and Evie's parents had a couple of night vision cameras, so we thought, why not? We went to the Bonkers Plaza, where it had a store where I worked at. The plaza was next to a gas station called Dino Store. That was next to a river. Me and Evie went to the plaza, while the rest went to the Dino Store. That's when Evie asked about the time we worked the night shift, and the items in the store get thrown around. I laughed, saying that's why they named it Bonkers Plaza. You never know what comes in those doors. I then got the idea that we should investigate the plaza. We went back to the others at the gas station. I told them my idea. Evie didn't like the idea because of a couple of bad experiences at that bad place. I told her, don't worry. It will be okay now. There's more of us. She said, you know I hate it there, especially at night, since that incident. I know, but please, it's been years since that happened, I told her. I said, we should come back and investigate here after we investigate Mystery Ranch. Sam agreed, since we might just send home by the ranch's security. We then all agreed with that plan, all except Evie. We then got in the car and drove to the mystery ranch. We parked about a half-mile from the ranch. We got all the equipment out. We had 3 night vision cameras, 3 walkie-talkies, 5 flashlights, 1 medkit, and a pistol with 1 magazine. Jacob began sparking up a joint, and we began talking about what there is, what's out there at the mystery ranch. I said skinwalkers. It's the only reason everybody visits Mystery Ranch. Evie asked about the basket lady. Rumor has it, she took a couple of kids, and the family stay quiet about it, so she won't come back. Katie also said, what about the water babies? I heard you can't go by the river or lakes at night. Jacob said, why can't you go out by the water at night? Katie replied, you will hear what sounds like a baby crying in the water, and when you go to see it, a horde of what appear to be dead babies covered in moss grab you, and you're never seen again. Jacob, of course, just laughed. Sam then talked about goatmen. I seen him once in a bar. Sam was sitting on a stool, pounding a few shots, when a strange-looking guy came in and stood next to him. He asked the bartender for a drink and asked Sam how it's going. Sam said fine today, since it wasn't so bad. That's when Sam happened to look down at his feet and only see goat hooves. Sam freaked out and looked at the guy, and that's when he saw the head of a goat. The goatman began to laugh and drew the attention of the whole bar. Everybody in the bar took one look and ran out of the bar screaming of fright. Sam fainted that he had never seen anything so horrifying. When he woke up, the thing was gone. The bar completely empty. Even the bartender had left. Jacob laughed and said enough of that stupid story. Sam, oh yeah, Jacob, what are you scared of being out there? Jacob said that time an alien got its blood on a marijuana plant and made some killer glob of resin after it got smoked. Sam laughed again and said that's so dumb, what a stupid stoner story. Let's get ready and head out. As everybody was getting geared up, Jacob said, let's not run into a Windigo on our way there. We split into 3 teams. Me and Evie, Team 1. Sam and Katie, Team 2. That left Jacob by himself, Team 3. Okay, I said. Team 1 will go to the abandoned house, where the kids went missing. Team 2 will go where the ranch's livestock stay. Team 3 will investigate on the dirt road where Skinwalker and Windigo sightings have happened. Jacob got the pistol, because he was all by himself. We all then split up and went on our way. Me and Evie made their way to the abandoned house. I was holding the camera, while Evie had the flashlight and radio. I began recording while talking to the guys, like paranormal busters. I asked, is this the place where that thing is to the child? that was using the restroom? Nothing happened. I then said, the mom saw you watching her lay in her bed. She said, you was looking at her through the window with your big red eyes. The next day you were gone and so was her son, I said. And again, nothing. I turned around, said this is pointless to Evie. We ain't gonna get anything. The radio began making a static sound. We looked at the radio, and that's when something hit the ground right in front of us. We looked and seen a dead dog carcass. Then, we heard a loud thump right behind us. We slowly looked behind us to see a large figure with a dead deer head. It then made a loud shriek, grabbing me by my leg. All I could see was what appeared to be a tall, skinny body as I was upside down. It then threw me to the ground, started to claw at my back. Evie froze in fear, holding the radio with the static still going. I then yelled at Evie to run. She then snapped out of it, running back to the van. I was trying to do everything I could to fight this thing. I was throwing dirt and rocks at it, grabbing at anything I could. And there was nothing I could do, as it grabbed me by the neck with only one hand. It began to choke me slowly, as the only thing I could see is a dark figure with a deer head with red eyes. As I began to lose consciousness, I hear 3 bangs, very distinct bangs. The thing then lets me go. I could barely move. I look to see Jacob aiming his pistol at it. He fires a couple more times, but it didn't faze this thing. It then opened its mouth while shrieking and tried to bite Jacob on the neck. It did, snapping his neck. He died instantly. The thing ran away with him still in his mouth. I began screaming for help. That's when Evie and the others came and found me. Evie asked where's Jacob. I told him to come help you while I got in the car. I said that thing took him. We gotta get him. That's when a bunch of spotlights were on us. A bunch of MAI agents were telling us to freeze. They asked us questions about what we were doing and what we saw. We told them. They said to keep quiet about Jacob and to say he ran away when asked. A few days passed when they found Jacob's body. It was across the river that was by the stores. Somebody found his body in what looked to be a woodshed in the woods. There were other remains of a missing family in there. Evie said that's why she hated it at the store, because of the strange activity there. I think it's just a ghost of the victims killed by that thing haunting the stores. I don't know. It's all just a mystery. I still work at the store sometimes, and I still see Jacob walking at the corner of my eye, only to disappear when I look at him. I wish we just investigated the store instead. Maybe then, Jacob would still be alive. I don't think this one will be the end of our team. It was 8 p.m., and we were 1 hour from closing the supermarket that I work at. There was only 3 people working at that night. Me and 2 other girls that worked the night shift. The store was called the Plaza Market, and it was only a few miles away from the famous Skinwalker Trail. I was working the cash register, while the 2 girls were stocking the shelves. There was nobody in the store when I began to fall asleep. That's when a customer had come in. I've never seen this guy before, but working in a supermarket, it was nothing unusual. I said hello, and I noticed the guy smelled like death. I try not to be rude when the guy asked if I had a smoke. I told him no, and that I don't smoke. The guy then asked if I've ever seen any pretty girls around here. I looked at him and said not at night. Everybody usually goes in at night. The guy looked at me kind of angrily and said, "You know where the girls are. If you don't tell me, I'll just take you on the trail and vanish with you." I laughed and said, "Whatever, man." That's when the guy told me, "You don't know much about Navajo people, don't you?" He said he practices black magic and can shapeshift into anything he wants. Me being a half-breed Native American, I said, "I'm a sundancer, and that his black magic will only hurt him if he tries on me." The guy said it might not work on you, but what about the girls that work here? You can't save them. I then said to the guy, I don't like threats, and I demanded he leave the store. He did, but after saying he will be back, but in another form. I laughed at him and said his black magic will only work on the others that don't know how to bless themselves, but not me. Now, it was around 8:45, 15 minutes until we close. I didn't think of blessing the plaza, or the girls and myself. I thought the strange man was just crazy talking, maybe from watching a dumb Skinwalker ranch show. I went outside to grab the cart, and bringing them back inside, when I heard a scream. I hurried, running back inside. That is when I saw the thing. It was a tall, skinny black shadow, glowing red eyes, standing in front of the girls. The thing was towering tall, maybe around 9 or 10 feet, with a giant dog-like head. The thing grabbed one of the girls by their hair and began to drag her out of the store. Me and the other girls grabbed onto her leg, pulling her towards us. The thing was so strong for the both of us and was almost out of the store with the girl. That is what an elder, who was also a sundancer, walked in and saw it. He looked at the thing and began to say a prayer in Ute. The thing then let go of the girl and tried going after the older man. The old guy was a lot stronger than the thing and pushed it back out the door with ease. The old guy then told the thing, "My good medicine is a lot stronger than your bad." The thing ran off in the dark, howling and screeching. The man asked us if we were okay. They was, and it was closing time. But because of what he did, we let him shop for his needs and then closed. He blessed the two girls, but ran out of sage to bless me. He told me, "You're a sun dancer. You got nothing to be afraid of." I laughed. I only danced for 12 years, which I'm good, but I'm no pro, like the old man who has danced his whole life. I said bye to him and the girls as I began to walk home. I was about 1 mile, maybe a mile and a half to my house. I had to walk through an open field that was very dark until I made it to the road. I was a quarter way to my house, and I thought I'd heard one of the girls I worked with say, "Hey, stop." I turned around, and that's when I saw the thing from the store. The only thing I could see was its glowing red eyes looking at me. The thing then said in one of the girls' voice, "I really like you," as it began to run after me. I turned around, bolting down the trail. I got about halfway when I fell over, and the thing began to claw at me with its giant elongated fingers. The thing ripped my shirt off, and I began to bleed. I grabbed some dirt, throwing it at it. The thing howled as it stopped attacking me. I got up and began to run. I made it to my house, thinking I had lost the thing. I had hidden my house in the dark, looking out the window. I saw nothing. I ran to my room, grabbed my WSAR-10 that was specially blessed by my elder. To give you an idea, the gun had holy damage for those that don't understand. Any other gun will not work than these things. I grabbed the gun, but could not find any mags. I thought I knew where they were. That's when I heard a knocking on my window. I froze, looked up at it. That's when I heard somebody say, "This is where you live. I found you." I recognized the voice as the man that stank of death. I yelled at him to go away, and I got my rifle with me. The man just laughed and said, "Guns won't work on me," as I shape-shifted back into that tall, skinny thing. He broke my window, grabbing for me as I ran to my other room. I began looking around for the magazine, where I found a little 15-round one. I said it's better than nothing, and exclaimed. I stood there in the dark, listening. The thing jumping on the roof, stomping around, having a tantrum and howling. The thing then jumped off the roof, and now all was quiet. I loaded my rifle and walked to the front room, looking out the window. There was nothing there. That's when the thing then slammed against my door, breaking it open. The thing then walked in imitating one of the girls' voices, saying, "There you are," as I began to walk toward me. I put the round in the chamber, firing a couple of times at it. I hit it once in the leg, twice in the gut. The thing ran and screeched out the door, howling in pain. The police then arrived at the scene from somebody calling, saying they had heard gunshots. I explained to them what had happened. The police don't believe me, saying it was a home invader and I was overreacting. The next day, I went to work with the same girls from last night. One of them said a white lady went missing after a stranger walked in the bar. The stranger had been shot in the stomach and leg, and the lady went to give him a ride to the hospital. She was never seen again. Everybody else at the bar said they had never seen the man before, and that he had stunk of death. I was taking a hike one day. Nothing out of the ordinary for me at this point. I'm very experienced with the outdoors and hiking, but not too much experience with overnight camping for days on end, or even spelunking, like some of my good friends are. As my journey began, I found myself in an easygoing mood. Occasionally, if I have nothing better to do on a weekend morning, I'll take a hike by myself, out in the wilderness, right near my house, since I do live alone. This time, it just ended so much different. I was taking one of these hikes into very uncharted territory for me. I enjoy exploring things where people have not gone before. So, I was walking through the woods one day, Nothing unusual so far, right? Well, I had my headphones on listening to music. At first, it was just some nice relaxing nature type stuff, like birds and chirping, leaves rustling. And I got to this point where there's an almost trance-like tune with sounds like a flute playing alongside it. It's actually quite soothing if you can get into that kind of mindset. After about 10 minutes of walking, with this music and ambiance in my ears, I began to hear something else, other than just the lovely sounds of nature. What sounded like someone calling me by name began echoing through the forest from somewhere up ahead. Call me crazy, which is what everybody now probably thinks after reading this, but I actually stopped to try and listen closer. I felt like the calling was getting louder, which is what led me to believe it was coming from somewhere ahead, even though usually I wouldn't really want to be startled by anything or anyone. Something about this situation, though, intrigued me. It sounded like somebody was calling my name, but why would somebody do that? Who would be out here that I knew? Was somebody pranking me? What if it was some kind of pervert stalker following me? The mystery had piqued my interest, so I decided to venture forth to find the source. A few people are probably reading this thinking, what an idiot. And with that in mind, at first, I tried turning around and heading back home, or just going off somewhere deeper, but still in the same direction. I couldn't. It was almost as if this invisible leash was keeping me tethered to the spot, and my legs refused to budge. And I heard it again. Adam, come here. This time, it sounded like the voice coming from right behind me. My reflexes kicked in, and without thinking, I jumped. Thank God. As soon as I landed back on the ground, this humongous black wolf with glowing green eyes had appeared out of nowhere, 10 feet in front of me. For a second, I considered running away, but something about this animal seemed familiar and too human-like. It was almost as if I had recognized it, or him. I turned and saw the same wolf sitting there looking at me, now behind me, which was now just in front of me. It smiled at me like a person would, and the body of it began to shift and change until it wasn't a wolf anymore at all, but a human being. And not just any human being, me. I felt myself getting weak in the knees, collapsing right there to the ground out of pure shock. Try imagine dropping something very expensive. That's kind of how I felt, and my mind was having a hard time processing what was taking place right in front of me. This person or thing who appeared out of nowhere was me. However, it was me from a few years earlier, when I was still in college. I remember everything about that time period, including the textbooks I used and how many hours of sleep I got each night. It was also kind of my goth phase. I looked different, acted different, and had a different group of friends. This person, deity, or thing was taking my form during that time frame. But the voice that it was trying to mimic, me, was different. It reached out its hand to try and grab mine. I was reluctant and terrified when the figure, still keeping its hand out held, began to shift and move around until it transformed into an old man wearing long red robes. This man, in an old raspy voice, who was so old appeared blind, explained to me that he was a shapeshifter of the forest and could take on any form he wanted, and that my soul was up for taking. My blood was what he wanted to taste. Completely petrified by what was happening, I had no choice but to get out of that situation, and fast. I turned, running as fast as my body would possibly let me, with a speed I didn't even think was capable, until I could hear my own voice calling my name to come back. It began to crackle and distort. I didn't dare look behind me. We all know what happens when that happens in horror movies. You always end up tripping on a root or something. I didn't want to see that old man take my form again. I used to know this route all too well. It used to be one of my favorite spots to hike and be alone. But now no longer because of this shapeshifter. I don't tell this story to many people. I know they won't believe me. I just try and keep it to myself anymore. However, I have been back to the same spot several times since this happened, but never again have I ever heard my name being called from deep in those woods. I guess it's safe to assume that this man, or deity, is still lurking around the area, looking for a vessel for his own soul. If you're reading this story, then please keep a lookout. Tell me if you notice anything strange while you yourself go on hikes. You'll never know if he'll be around. Even all these years later, I still cannot explain what happened. This is something I'll never forget. It was autumn of 2011. I was a very avid bird watcher during this time. I used to go out all throughout spring, summer, and fall bird watching. But there was one particular wooded area where I was very fond of that had an abundance of birds. I'll remember it. It was a Saturday morning. I brought my binoculars with me, and I walked into the woods. There were no trails here, just small game trails and little footpaths that would lead me along. I really wanted to find some good birds today. It had also been a very dry fall, and the water level in these parts weren't as high as usual. There's generally a lot more ponds and lakes, so traversing through here isn't as easy. It felt like every other woodland creature was also keeping clear of the forest. But why? I noticed all the woodland creatures around me weren't being their usual selves, chirping and chittering. It was more quiet than usual. I continued my way, for maybe about 45 minutes, into a pathway I did not recognize, until up ahead, I saw a nice large pond. Maybe it could even be considered a small lake, just through the trees up ahead. This would be a great place to hold up camp for the day. It looked like a fantastic birdwatching spot. As I got closer, though, I heard something very odd. Something splashing in the water, making loud noises. I looked around. There were no signs of any fish or any other wildlife causing this. Nobody in the general vicinity, like throwing stones in the lake. However, off to my right behind a tree, I spotted what appeared to be a large tall man in a trench coat. At least, that's what the silhouette would have me believe. It was black. Full black. Again, I'm in a wooded area where nobody really comes out in. I even walked an additional 45 minutes off the small little dirt path. I crept forward slowly, peeking through some trees at where I thought this noise was coming from, and as I watched it for more minutes, I could tell that it wasn't quite a man, so I don't know what it was, but it had the shape and general figure like one. It was very large, and as I wrote already, completely black. It wasn't just taking stones and throwing them. It was picking up small boulders, easily the size of a basketball, if not double in size, and chucking them into the lake. Every time, there would be a huge splash. I couldn't fully see what it was doing, since it was partially concealed by the trees and brush, but enough that I could see the movement of it throwing these small boulders into the lake, at roughly 100 to 200 feet away from it. No man or human being that I am remotely aware of can chuck a 50-pound boulder 100 plus feet into the air into a lake. That's just not possible. It really creeped me out. So I decided to ex-nay on birdwatching that day, and very hastily turned around and making my way back. I guess you can maybe say it was possibly a Bigfoot, if you believe in that sort of thing. But whatever it was, I was not willing to make friends with it. I have no reason to make this up. I don't want my name being attached to this. I don't want any notoriety from this whatsoever. I'm just kindly sharing my experience of something I believe could potentially be supernatural. I don't know, though. You'll have to be the judge. Here's my story. I have a friend who lives roughly an hour away from where I live. He's a really nice guy. We've been great friends for years now. One day, he calls me up and says he has to tell me something, but not over the phone. It's hard to talk about it, especially through that medium. So, we set up a time to meet each other at his place. When that didn't end up working out, due to a cancellation of up-and-coming plans, we end up meeting each other and decide to go on one of our favorite trails. This is where the story happens. We're walking, and he's telling me something in his personal life that's really bothering him. I won't share it, out of respect for his privacy, but anyway, it's girl-related. He needed somebody to talk about, and I am his best friend, so naturally he chose me. That's when we heard the screaming. It was a scream that I can't even begin to describe. It sounded like a woman screaming, intermixed with a raid siren and a wolf howl, all in one. Now, take that sound and put it through an old AM radio. That's the sound we'd heard. It wasn't too far away, but far away enough that it was reverberating pretty heavily throughout the woods. My friend and I stopped dead in our tracks, wide-eyed, looking in that direction, the direction it came from. We both just stopped, and at the same time asked, "What was that?" We didn't know what it was. It was winter after all, and I know there's different animals that come out at this time of year. While there was no snow, it was already colder than a witch's titty outside. We kept on moving, got back to our conversation, and tried our best to ignore what we had just heard and the curiosity surrounding it. This is when it sounded off yet again, this time sounding much closer than before. We both froze up, and he just began running. I was too stunned to move at first, but his reaction had given me some sort of cue to run, so I did. I had asked him on the ride home what it was that he needed to talk about, because he kind of beat around the bush. At this point, he wouldn't tell me. He was too shaken up by what we had heard. While I do believe in things like Ouija boards and spirits, this sounded more like a woman screaming than anything else. My friend texted me not too long ago, letting me know that whatever it is that happened that day still haunts him. And just an FYI, I know what mountain lions sound like. This did not sound anything like a mountain lion. It sounded much different. For this story, I'll call myself Phil. First, some info on me. I'm a fisherman hobbyist, an amateur, not a professional by any means, but I have been doing it since my teenage years. I love it. There's something about the peace and tranquility that comes with sitting by a quiet pond or lake. The time to daydream, think of what you want out of life, and just enjoy yourself. So, I've been doing this for a while now, and I seem to have my favorite spots all picked out. Many of them, I find a lot of success. I've caught salmon, trout, small bass, you name it. All things that are delicious to eat. Both the ponds that I fish at are secluded enough that you don't have to run into many people. Sure, there's been a few times I've run into some competition, but not really much at all. They never stay long. We have a mutual fisherman respect for each other. The one in particular that I'm fond of is surrounded by thick redwoods, so you see very little wildlife, besides birds of course, and the occasional deer. The other place that I go to has less trees surrounding it. It's more open, but you can pretty much see for miles around you. It's more open and more wide, making it feel bigger than the other one. There are some hills too, and some thick woods. The hills aren't too steep, and there's only a couple of ways to get into the pond, which have small paths worn down from me, previously walking on them countless times before. So, enough of that. My day starts off fairly normal. I make my plans to go fishing solo, since sometimes I bring my buddies. I go to one of my favorite spots up near the mountain where I live. It's pretty secluded and quiet. My life had been pretty hectic as of late, and I desperately needed some mental escape. I jump in my truck, having already grabbed my equipment that I would need. I arrived at the pond with time to spare. I decided now was a great time to relax and eat a sandwich. It was almost 7 a.m., but I never usually went out this early, so it was worth a try. After all, they do say fish bite better in the morning. The sun was creeping up slowly, and I walked around scouting the best spot that seemed most likely to have fish. You know you probably found your spot when all of a sudden, without realizing it, you can see splashes and bubbles coming up from the water. Bingo, fish activity. From that point on, it was smooth sailing. At least that's what I had hoped. After casting my rod and relaxing for a while, I did not even get one nibble. Talk about unlucky. A few hours had gone by at this point, and still nothing. The turkey sandwich I'd brought for breakfast was now wearing off, and I was getting hungry. And the fish were just not really biting this day. And out of nowhere, completely random experience, the largest buck I had ever seen in my life just comes casually waltzing in across the pond to graze. And when I say huge, I mean humongous. Easily the size of a bull elk. My mouth literally drops open at the sight of just how huge this buck was. It turns to look right at me as it notices me, and immediately I noticed something weird about it. Its face was different. Hard to describe it. I can't tell if it's an angry look or if the deer is genuinely scared. It's like it has this menacing look on its face that made me very uncomfortable. It kept its focus on me, staring as it kept grazing. It wasn't the fact that it kept staring at me that had me bothered. Deers do this after all when they're cautious. It was the expression and its face. It was so human. I tried to shake the feeling off and divert my focus back to my fishing rod, hoping and praying I would get a bite, so I could finally put my mind and mental energy elsewhere, instead of that deer staring at me. Minutes go by, and nothing happens with my rod. I glance over again for one quick second, and the deer looks back at me. I look at it, and now it slowly pulls itself up into a standing position by the tree stump. Now it's on two legs, holding itself up, staring over at me still. And I could see its face better now that it's not partially hidden behind the tall grass. I was scared by this point, nearly dropping my rod on the ground. I got up and slowly start to walk backwards, keeping my eyes locked with this deer. I had never in my life felt threatened by a deer before, until now. I was about 10 yards away from the trail. I quickly turn around and run straight towards the truck, hopping in and locking the doors behind me. I wasn't going to take any chances. I was probably being overly scared, but either way, if you ever see a large deer walking on its hind legs, it's eerie. I lock all the doors and pull out my phone and call a park ranger. I'll never forget their response when I asked them, "You realize there's a large upright walking buck out here, right?" And they say, "What?" As if I'm crazy. They humored me and had somebody to come check it out. I never heard anything back. I imagine they probably laughed at me. The next day after work, I'm driving home, like usual. Decide to stop by the same spot I had the day before, the same place I had seen the deer. I walked around the pond to where I had seen it, and sure enough, there were tracks left behind. Massive hoof prints in the mud, and a very bipedal pattern leading from the stump that it stopped to graze at, up to the tree line where I saw it. I didn't see it after this, but the memory of that deer really creeps me out. Even more was the expression and the look it was giving me. Like it was almost human. I'm getting goosebumps just now, thinking back to it. remembering back on this occasion. It was January 1st, and at the time, I worked at a small restaurant just outside of town. My brother would also come in for shifts. He was the assistant manager. Yeah, it wasn't always easy working with family. Anyway, I was on my cigarette break, texting my girlfriend. We were in the middle of a very complicated discussion about what we were going to watch come Saturday night on our Netflix binge. I'm staring down at my phone and I have this ominous sensation come over me. I don't know what it was or how to describe it, but it was like that something was wrong. Maybe it was premonition. Maybe. I put my phone down and threw my cigarette on the ground, stomped it to put it out. I walk back inside, finish the last 4 hours of my shift. Nothing happens. I get off work, get in my car, and I begin to pull out of the parking lot. A quick note about our little restaurant. It's more of a tiny diner that sits right out of town. We don't get a whole lot of traffic, especially later on at night, like I was working. Mainly passerbyers and, wouldn't you know it, a lot of dirty old trucker men who are always looking to grope one of my friend's waitresses. My manager and owner was one of my good friends, which is one of the reasons I got the job and one of the main reasons my brother was assistant manager. That might or may not be an irrelevant detail. So there I am, pulling out of the parking lot in my little Honda Civic, getting ready to turn on the main highway. And as I'm checking both lanes of traffic, which are pretty much dead, I see movement in the woods off to my right-hand side, just beyond the fir tree. I immediately put my foot on the brake before pulling out, thinking a large deer is about getting ready to jump out. I'm not risking having my small car get totaled. It's the only transportation I have at this point in time. So I wait, and I'm staring at it, expecting it to come out at any moment, or at least get ready to. But it's kind of moving slowly and moving weirdly, not in a way that a large deer would. So I'm staring, waiting for this thing, when it slowly peeks its head around the fir tree, and I see this glowing eye looking at me. Not the same way you'd see from a deer. A deer's eyes will glow, but only when you have bright lights, like a headlight, reflecting into them. The only problem was, I was seeing that same ominous glowing light coming from one of this thing's eyes. The other was behind the tree, but there were no lights shining on it or into it. And it was slowly peeking its head out from behind the tree, staring off in my direction, which I can only assume was me since I was the only thing in view. There were only 2 or 3 other cars in the parking lot, and nobody was outside at this point in time. That leaves me the last man on the totem pole, and it almost kind of shuffles out from behind the tree, but still concealed in the shadows of the canopy. I can make out enough from the silhouette that I know for certain whatever I was looking at was not a deer, but I could tell you it was very large based on its size alone. And as this was going on, that bad feeling that happened to me earlier came back, and this time settled right in the very pit of my stomach. I understood it as premonition, that I was going to die, and that this animal was coming to take my life. So, out of sheer reaction, my body, not me, my foot slams on the gas pedal, and my back tires do the cliché squealing, spitting out lots of smoke and rubber, and I peel out of that parking lot, not even looking for traffic coming left or right. And my entire drive home, which is roughly 15 to 20 minutes, is just a blur. I never actually truly saw what was in the trees, but the feeling it gave off was something very, very wrong. I can't really tell you much about what it was, but what I can say is I believe it had some sort of supernatural force behind it, like a demon or an entity. When I got home that night, I paced around my house, trying to fall asleep, but nothing would work. I tried melatonin, melaleuca, and some other various essential oils my girlfriend left over at my house. I was too shaken up. So that's when I got on the internet. It was about 1 in the morning. I tried to research anything I could. to try and find any details on what it was that I experienced. Did the Grim Reaper come to visit me? Or was this something else? Perhaps a skinwalker? But after spending about 30 to 45 minutes of reading on the internet, things pointed to a creature, what many refer to as a dogman, an upright, tall, walking dog-like monster. I'll say this once more. I did not fully see the creature at hand, but I saw that it was very large, and I saw the two glowing yellow eyes staring back at me, and I had read enough descriptions of stories to know that all things pointed back to this creature. The possibility of that thing being right outside a restaurant is very disturbing. To know that it could come back, or perhaps maybe it's there, still, waiting for me, waiting for the right moment to show itself. Or perhaps it really is there to take my life. I'm thinking about buying a gun, but if this thing is as terrifying as many say it is, maybe a gun won't do much damage to it. Any comments to this post are greatly appreciated. First, I'll give a little background information on myself. My name is Kevin. I enjoy camping and hiking, but I've never seen anything like this before. I live in South Carolina. My home is around Greenville, or the Charleston area. If you're familiar with that at all, then that's around the general vicinity of where I'm located. Okay, on to my story. It was midday when my friend Brent called me, asking if I wanted to go camping for the weekend. He had gotten a free pass from his boss due to a very unfortunate accident at work. He works as an electrician, and so something happened on the job site which he never fully told me about. But anyway, it freed him up for a couple of days. I chuckled and told him I could hook up with him for a free night and we could choose our favorite spot, located between the woods of Greenville. I asked him how much it was, if he needed me to cover any additional expenses. He said none. He was surprised I actually agreed to go. We ended up going later that day, and I was not able to drive out there until midnight, after having dinner with family. As soon as we got out there, we made food and set up camp, albeit late. But that night was strange. After I had closed my eyes, I didn't get much sleep. I was very uncomfortable, especially when you lay on the ground and you're not used to it. Brent's snoring did not help either. And to top everything off, something just felt wrong. I felt something evil around us. It was this oppressive feeling that kept me from drifting off into a deep sleep. I've been camping before, but this was different. There was something sinister waiting in the woods, as if it were hunting us down. The air felt cold and empty, but there were sounds of what seemed to be branches breaking nearby, like something large quickly moving through the trees towards our location. In an attempt to calm my nerves, I put my head back down onto the ground, listening closely to Brent's snoring, hoping that would somehow lull me into a deep sleep, despite being on uncomfortable ground. After laying there for what felt like forever, I eventually fell back asleep, waking up to the sounds of birds chirping. The sun was already shining. We were supposed to be waking up early for a hike today, but we missed out on that opportunity. We were exhausted. We went into town, ate breakfast before driving back. I never told him about how uneasy I felt that night, of something strange happening, something weird lurking around. He hadn't seemed to notice. I did my best to try and just shrug it off, like nothing ever happened. So, we were sitting by the fire that night, getting pretty tired. None of us were really saying much. I think we were ready to go to bed. Finally, I got up, said I was going to bed. Brent followed me not long after, saying he wanted to go on another hike first thing in the morning, so he had to get some good shut-eye. That's when we heard it. We all heard this scream of pure terror, echoing through the trees. Let me remind you that we were away from everything. The frequency of it meant that whoever or whatever made that noise was very close by. It sounded like a woman who had seen something terrifying and then was screaming out of sheer horror as if watching her own house burn down with her family inside. It put us on edge immediately. It sounded like she was only several hundred yards away. Brent looked at me wide-eyed, asked what was going on. I asked him, "What was that?" To which he replied, "I have no idea." We sat there for a few more seconds before we had heard movement in the woods. We all got up, grabbing our flashlights before shutting them off into the trees. That's when we had heard the noise. The noise was so much more like an animal than we initially thought. It was the sound of a large ape, or something that doesn't sound like it's supposed to actually exist, like nails on a chalkboard, but at the same time it wasn't. It was clearly some sort of animal, but nothing I had ever heard of before. That's when we started hearing other noises as well, mixed in with what sounded like a woman screaming. There were now growls and snarls coming from everywhere around us. Sometimes, there would be several different animals all around us making the same horrific sounds, all at the same time. My heart was now pounding out of my chest, and I began to realize I might die here. Whatever is out here is hunting us. We were now being surrounded, and we weren't sure what to do at this point. We were beyond terrified. That's when Brent simply just said, "Well, I'm not dying here." He threw down his flashlight and suddenly began charging into the dark woods. He disappeared in an instant, making his way towards the road to get away from whatever was surrounding our campsite. The rest of us were just standing there frozen in terror. We knew what awaited him if he got caught. Despite our fear, we charged after him, so this wasn't an all for nothing. Whatever was around us sounded like large, hungry wolves. We kept pushing, no matter what, trying as hard as we could, even though these things were gaining on us, till we almost got to the road. We could see the lights up ahead on our car. We had made it. As soon as we had gotten the car, we locked all the doors and Brent revved up our engine, peeling out of there. There were these animals chasing us now. I'm not sure what they were, but I can tell you they weren't human. They had long black-like hair on their bodies and claws like lions, teeth like sharks, and they walked on two legs. They looked at me with these piercing yellow eyes, seemed to glow in the dark. There is something about this that truly frightens me every time I think about it. I don't know what they are or where they came from. They looked like werewolves, something akin to the movies like Dog Soldiers, American Werewolves in London. That's what they reminded me of. We were petrified. It was obvious these creatures were hunting us. I never in my life believed these creatures were real until this night, and I hope you don't have to go through an experience like this, like we did. We do not know what those things were, but judging by their behavior, I would guess they were either a type of wolf-like creature or extremely large apes. They certainly weren't human. No human could have made the sounds we had heard that night. I'm going to leave it at that for now. The nightmares will continue to plague me, thinking about what might have happened if we did not get out of there when we did. None of us told our friends and families about it either. Nobody would believe a word we'd say. What good would it do us anyway? I just hope I never have to encounter those things again. That's my experience. Sorry if this was a little scattered, but I wrote it right after it happened. Try not to think about it. Thank you for reading. I used to live in the Yukon territories in Canada. I worked as a zoologist and was really into cryptids, like Bigfoot or the Yeti. I used to spend hours looking through books on cryptid sightings and even hunting expeditions, trying to find something that could help me authenticate a story. As it happens, one day, I saw something unusual while I was doing my job one day. It all started when I got hired for an adventure tour company that took people on hunting trips into the Yukon territories. I had just gotten my zoology degree and was very excited about seeing some real wildlife in Canada. There aren't a whole lot of jobs for zoologists, so it can be picky when you finally get your shot. It turns out that hunting really isn't allowed in these territories, but we were going there to actually look for a Bigfoot. The government apparently wasn't too happy about this. They thought we would bring on poaching and other bad behavior. we were able to successfully convince them otherwise. I don't know how, but my logistics guy works his magic. Anyhow, we went camping twice a week, around the different areas of the province, looking for signs of any activity or unusual animal tracks. We began finding a lot of weird tracks after a few weeks. The second time I went out with the trackers, we found some unusual prints around the area. They were about twice as large as human feet, and there were 3 toes in each foot, which looked like it could have been formed by a bear, but far more canine in appearance. The thing was, there weren't any signs of bear activity in that area for miles. While we had seen lots of grizzly bears before when we went camping up near the national park, they usually stick to their own areas. They don't go wandering around these regions. It wasn't your typical dog either, because dogs tend to leave a V-shaped footprint, while these particular prints had more of an arch. They weren't man-made. They looked like they were made by a large bipedal wolf, which was a very disturbing discovery, as you can imagine. When I came back the next time, we found more prints that looked similar, except these were closer to a man's size. We also began hearing howling in the distance. There was no way it could have been a wolf. They don't usually make these kinds of noises. It kind of sounded like a person screaming or something, although I couldn't really tell what it was. It was echoing off in the mountains around us. I do remember looking up at one point, and we had heard something big coming in our direction from all around. We looked off on the hilltop, about 100 feet away from us. We can see this large black wolf running on all fours in our direction, then quickly disappearing behind the tree line, hiding. I remember looking over at one of our trackers, and he said, "Wolf, yeah." He was probably used to seeing wolves in the area, because we were north of the park. We continued tracking that day, and headed back deep into the camp in the woods. As it turns out, I was not hallucinating. Something was watching us from the tree line. As we went back to our tents after dinner, we heard heavy breathing behind our camp, which was like 50+ yards away from the tree line, and then something coming out of the bushes that sounded like it was trying to be stealthy. It was pretty dark outside at this point. We were putting wood on our campfire, so we couldn't make out all too well, until one of the other trackers pulled a torch, a flashlight for you North American readers. That's when I saw what can only be described as a sort of werewolf-like creature running through the trees. It had a big bushy mane and looked almost more ape-like than canine, despite the obvious dog head shape and ears. Also human, and definitely walked upright. I've told others my story about seeing what I believe to be a Bigfoot, or what I assume was a Bigfoot, and they all agreed it had to have been watching us the whole time. Judging from the canine appearance, maybe we're believing that this wasn't exactly a Bigfoot after all. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Either way, I don't think I'll be going back to the Yukon territories anytime soon. This happened to me back in 2007. However, I'm still very haunted by this experience. Even now, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, enduring the nightmares of the beast that I saw. My wife and I, whom we were only dating at the time, not even yet engaged, were camping at almost the northern tip of Washington state. Not quite Canada, but not quite near the border either. We were going through more of a rougher patch in our relationship. Things were getting kind of tumultuous. For a portion of the camping trip, we were having a rough time getting along. The outside stresses of life were bleeding into our relationship. After a few days, we kind of mellowed out. I think it was the nature, as nature seems to have that effect on us. We had been camping in the same spot for about 3-4 days now. We weren't sure if we wanted to move spots yet. Our goal was to try and be out here for a good 2 weeks. That was the plan. While we did pack enough food and supplies, I was very adamant about making our own traps and catching our own rabbits and other animals. Even getting water from the stream, boiling it, really roughing it out, you know? At least that's what I wanted. My wife, or girlfriend at the time, wasn't so enthusiastic, even though she was all down for the whole 2-week survival trip. I don't think she wanted to put into it like I did. That was a part of where the tension came from, but anyway, after things mellowed out for the first 3 days, my wife kept explaining to me she was bothered. She kept feeling like something was off. I would always keep asking her what she meant by that, but she could never elaborate, and I'm not sure why. But she seemed bothered by something. This went on for another 3 or 4 days, and now at this point, we were roughly at about a week in. We were now really thinking about moving our camp spot to over on the other section of the stream we were near. After eating a good lunch of some rabbit that I'd caught earlier that day, we decided that we would take down our tent and move all of our supplies about a mile or two across to the other side of the stream. The woods were a little bit more thicker and denser here, but I think it would be worth it. I love being surrounded by the thickness of overgrowth and under the canopy of trees. There's something so mesmerizing by it, like you're entrapped in a jungle. I love the feeling. So, we had set up all of our supplies, organized it appropriately, and packed everything so we could move from location to location. We had now made our way across the stream. It was roughly 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and we're moving in the direction. The woods are becoming thicker by the moment. Oh, and by the way, I could not tell you exactly where we were. We started off on a trailhead but hiked about 4 or 5 miles off trail. We were in the middle of the forest. That's the only real way to camp, not these phony campgrounds that too many people cater to, where they have all their needs met. A water spigot, bathrooms, a water spigot. Not my thing. So we hiked for about another 30 minutes, possibly 45. Our initial plan was to only go about 1.5 miles, but by this point, we had gone farther into the forest than initially planned. This part of the woods was very dense and very dark. We also began to smell a really strange musty odor. Not like your typical forest smells. It kind of reminded me of wet dog, but I guess that coincides with the creature we saw. So we get to our spot, and my girlfriend begins to construct a fire. I work on setting up the tent and getting dinner prepped and situated. It's going to be dark here in the next few hours. We want to make sure we have everything as needed. Also, there's a smaller creek nearby, maybe about 1/4 mile away. I figured now would be the best time to go and get some water. I tell my girlfriend I'll be right back. So I take our large canteen and our jug and begin making my way over to the creek. It's probably about a good 400 or 500 meters, maybe 1/4 mile. I don't know. I begin walking through all this dense brush, and I get this peculiar feeling that I am being followed. Maybe it's my girlfriend. Maybe she's coming to tell me something. I turn behind me. No, she's not there. Okay, maybe it's just my own paranoia. After all, we are in a very thick part of the woods. So I keep pushing on. I get to the creek, fill up my canteen, and fill up our water jug, which by now, we had drinking it pretty low. And by this point, as soon as I get done filling up the canteen, I get this feeling that comes over me. I know I'm being watched, and something or somebody is out here with me, following me. I felt on edge, ready for something to happen at any given moment. I had a large hunting knife strapped to my ankle. I pulled it out and yelled, "Who's ever out here? I'm heavily armed. I'm not afraid to use the weapon I have." And just as I was listening for anything, I noticed then that the forest was very quiet, more quiet than usual. This did not sit well with me. I quickly stuck my knife back, kept it ready and accessible in case something were to happen. You never know. Maybe there's some axe-wielding serial killer out here who's crazy, who's stalking me and waiting for the right moment to split my skull in two. I made it back, double time. My girlfriend was asking me why I looked so pale and sweaty. I told her it's nothing, but the feelings of being followed and like something bad was going to happen persisted, all the way through having dinner. Although I ate very little, I usually am a guy with a pretty big appetite. My girlfriend thought it was strange I was hardly eating and wanted to know if I was feeling okay. I told her yeah. We just cuddled and sat by the fire, talking about our life scenario. I could not tell you at what time this happened, but it was after dark, so probably 9 or 10 p.m., maybe later. The mosquitoes were really bad this night. That much I do remember. And we heard movement of somebody moving around, coming towards our little campsite. My girlfriend and I were startled by this and started calling out hello, who's there? But every time we would do that, the sounds stopped. Like whoever it was realized we were there and realized we were aware of them, so they would stop. This made my girlfriend and I very uncomfortable. We were debating on whether to put out our fire and run and hide in our tent, or stand our ground with the only hunting knife that I had. After a short amount of time, maybe a minute, maybe a little more, movement continued. Closer. Whoever or whatever it was being very slow, very stealthy, trying to make as little noise as possible. But the leaves and twigs kept snapping underneath their weight. It sounded like a person, not like an animal moving around. In case you skeptics want to say we had just heard a deer, and we were overly scared and paranoid. My heart was beating so hard, I thought it was going to shoot out of my chest. I figured something was going to happen at any given moment. And just then, we heard this low growl, just off in the trees, right nearby. I looked at my girlfriend. She looked back at me. I told her to get inside the tent, now, and I grabbed hold of my knife, and I screamed out, "I'm not afraid of you, whoever you are. If you're going to want to touch my girlfriend, you got to go through me first." It went quiet again, and slowly, this thing began making its way towards the small opening where our campsite is. It was almost like it was step at a time, before it finally partially revealed itself. And in the light of the fire, the dim light, me and my girlfriend got a pretty good view of whatever this creature was. It resembled the large black wolf. The only problem was, it was standing upright on 2 legs. Its legs and thighs were like that of a dog, but its torso was more human-like, built the same way a man's would if they were to be lifting a lot of weights. Massive rippling biceps, arms that were disproportionately long, and a head that was so large it did not look like it would hold on top of that body. It glared at me and my girlfriend, like we were its next snack. I grabbed hold of my girlfriend's hand, who had at this point not taken my advice and hid in the tent like I had told her to. We grabbed hands. I looked at her and said, "Run." And without thinking, we both turned around and ran as fast as we could. I knew in that very moment, as we were running for our lives, there was no way I was going to be able to make it all the way back to the trailhead. We're talking about 6 or 7 miles away from our current location, and I could only hope we were running in the right direction. Also, we're running through dense vegetation and forest. Not exactly easy to navigate. It's not like we're on a game trail, and we have a clear straight shot to where we have to go. Our motivation to move is fueled by the fact that this thing is clearly coming after us. Not running to try and get us, but it's like it was trying to just keep up with us, and using very little effort to do so. As if it just wanted to make sure we were in a vicinity where if it wanted to reach out and grab us, it very well could have. We ended up making it about a mile, maybe 2, to the other stream, where we sat there, huddled together, and waited for the end. We were exhausted, and we could no longer outrun this thing anymore. We just sat down next to each other, held each other tightly, and awaited whatever fate may come. I think we must have passed out from sheer exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline burnout. Whatever creature or monster that thing was had followed us all the way to the second stream and circled around us, never showing itself or attacking us. It's almost like it was just tormenting us and toying with us. Like it didn't want to actually kill us, but more invoke fear in us to try and let us know it's the king of the forest, and we are helpless. As soon as morning light broke, I awoke my girlfriend. We had both fallen asleep cuddling each other against a tree, Out of sheer exhaustion and fear, we spent the rest of that morning hiking all the way back to the main trailhead and back to our car, not even caring we had completely abandoned our actual campsite, our expensive tent, our fire that we just left going, which is a huge fire hazard, our nice canteen, all of our supplies. We didn't care anymore. That thing could have it. We were not going back there to risk it. I don't know if we had somehow stumbled onto this thing's territory or what, but it has made me completely reevaluate the way I go into the woods, where I go, where I hike, and being aware of my surroundings. I saw what I believe was a Sasquatch roughly 5 years ago. I was 16 years of age and volunteering as a counselor at a day camp. A friend and I went for a walk on the trails within the camp. We were cleaning the trails, and we had also brought our lunches with us, which our plan was to eat later. We were on the outskirts of camp, maybe half a mile at most from the main camp area, very close to the Malala River. I was roughly 60 feet from a muddy creek, kind of a swampy area. I remember sitting down to eat lunch. My friend realized that he had left something back at the camp, and he really needed it. I can't remember what he went to get. Maybe a tool or something to drink. Anyway, he left. I remained seated on a log, waiting for him to come back. I expected the jog to take maybe, a whole 10 minutes at most. At this point, he had been gone for at least 7, and I'd heard something in the woods off to my left. I stood up to try and get a better look at what it was. What I observed was a massive, hairy, man-like animal standing next to a large tree. I believe it was cedar. It was about 50 feet away. I estimate that it was roughly 8 feet tall. I stood about 5'9". At the time, it was far taller than I. It was also very wide and bulky looking. The fur was thick and fairly long, maybe 6 inches, and medium brown in color. It looked directly at me for a few moments. We had solid eye contact. Its eyes were dark, very dark. It seemed to be shocked or surprised and was almost deciding what to do, based on the expression on its face. It stepped to its right, or my left, behind the large tree, and immediately it began to run away. I could not see it run away because the tree blocked my view, but I definitely heard it. It sounded very heavy. The footsteps could be heard clearly. It was snapping down branches as it ran, creating a lot of noise. It sounded very powerful. I listened to it run away for maybe 10 seconds. Then, I turned around and ran back on the trail towards camp. I ended up meeting up with my friend on his way back to meet me. I was also the only person that had actually witnessed the whole event. Since my friend was on his way back from retrieving something from the main camp as I'd waited, I may have been snacking on some of my lunch. Also, I have heard recent stories about a mother and a daughter in Beaver Creek, Oregon, who had apparently encountered Sasquatch, but I don't know any of the details. Beaver Creek, though, is not too far away from Malala, within the same county. My roommate and I were driving along Highway 224 between Carver and Barton at approximately 10 p.m. We saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness on the river side of the road. We frequently went to visit a cicada at night to go see a friend working at the safari club. We actually lived across from Rock Creek sand and gravel at the time. I lived in the immediate area all my life. As we got closer to the reflection, I could see a creature standing near the road behind some maple limbs. At first, when I saw the eyes, I assumed it was just an owl. When we went by it, I saw a creature from approximately chest to the top of head, with limbs obscuring the lower body. The color was very dark brown, its arms at its sides, and it stood there, looking as we drove on by. I didn't say anything for about a mile or so, and then asked my roommate if he had seen something along the highway. When he answered yes, I knew we weren't crazy. So, I asked him what he saw. He told me the same as what I saw. We decided to go back the next day in daylight to try and check out the area, to see if it's ultimately possible the whole thing could have been real. While there were no clear tracks, but there was definitely a trail crossing the highway to the river, from a swamp and bluff. On top of the bluff, it would have been somewhere between Damascus and Boring. The limb that we saw the creature behind was about 6.5 feet tall. Now, 2 or 3 years prior, a friend of ours who lived on Gronland Road was scared by a creature while walking home late at night. He saw it somewhere between Carver Bridge and Baker's Cabin. Anyway, he said it scared the heck out of him, and he ran the rest of the way home. I never used to really believe in hairy people before I saw it myself. I would, however, like to see one again. I was bow hunting and had parked myself between 2 separate deer trails, each running alongside a clear cut. I was dead center, 25 yards between me and each trail. I faced west, into the wind, at roughly dusk. There was usually a lot of deer in the area, but on that evening, it seemed very quiet. Just as it became too dark to see my aiming sights, I heard crunching footsteps coming from directly behind me. At the time, I thought it might be a buck and rut. The animals seemed to be following my scent directly to where I was hidden in some blackberry bramble. A cover scent had been applied to my clothing and boots using pine needles that were blended with water. My clothes were soaked in the solution and dried. Very effective, for deer anyway. This animal, though, walked upright, right to the clearing behind me. I had plenty of time to turn around and situate myself for a clear shot. I raised my bow, and it came into view 25 yards away and stopped. It seemed to know exactly where I was sitting. We were staring at each other from a distance of about 75 feet for roughly a full minute. The Bigfoot slowly swayed back and forth, a few inches from side to side. If I had to estimate, it would be roughly 7.5 feet tall, possibly 600 plus pounds. I never pulled on the bow, and the Bigfoot eventually turned around, walked in the same direction it had come from. Due to the thick foliage and leaves on the ground, no tracks were found the next day when I had returned to look around. This animal was black in color. Its shoulders were approximately 4 feet wide. Since this incident happened, I've brought up this subject with many people in the area, and am surprised at just how many have had, or know somebody who has had, experiences in this county alone. If you're ever in the area, look me up. We can take a trip into the Cascades here behind my home. I'll show you Bigfoot. Right off the bat, I'll tell you, I'm a 16-year-old kid, telling absolutely the truth. So God strike me dead if I'm lying. I hope you don't take my report as bogus because of my age. Now, let me explain my situation to you. I live and have lived on the Molalla River for the majority of my life. Never thought twice about walking around at night, or anywhere, period. About 2 months ago, I was alone in my grandmother's house, using her computer. I decided to go home. My house is only about 50 yards away. As I was stepping outside, the most hideous feeling of being alone and fear thumped my heart. I kept walking in terror when all of a sudden, about 30 feet off to my right, I hear a loud thumping and some crash. From there on, being distorted by my act of running faster than I've ever moved before. I could swear I heard the distinctive two-legged footsteps veering towards me from off the trail between the houses. I raced in my house, slamming the door, locking it, sitting there in the living room, trying to calm down from my strange experience. The oddest feelings flushed through me then and now. Before you dismiss my story as merely a frightened child running from noise, I'll have to tell you of the strange past of our 45 acres of land at the end of the Dickey Prairie Road. Now, around 3 years ago, when we had cattle and cows fenced on our property, I noticed casually how they would always stay together and go near the barns at night. One day, we had discovered 2 of them killed up in the woods by the drinking creek. The killings weren't average killings either. The cows did not have a single scratch on them. Both had broken necks, and their eyeballs sucked cleanly out. Since those experiences, I'm now scared to go hiking and traveling at night. Yes, average signs of fear, but I have the weird feeling of being an intruder. Thank you for your time, sincerely. Also, I am a believer. One other thing. When I was in 4th grade, my friend Heather and her brother were taking out some garbage when they claimed they saw a giant white monkey walk up the hill and away from the trash cans. They only lived about 5 miles away, but moved to Texas about 6 months after that happened. It apparently scared them so badly, they slept with their mother and dad in fear. And about 5 years ago, I had heard that some big investigators came to look at some tracks right across the Malala River from where I live. Very interesting, if you ask me. Before I go any further, I would like to emphasize that I'm not sure that I actually heard a Bigfoot sound. I'm mainly putting this on here because I have thought about it in depth, which is why the delay in reporting. And the only thing in my memory that has any resemblance at all to what I've heard is the past audio recordings of Bigfoot, although what I heard had better audio. I still wonder if this was a Bigfoot. How or why it would have been near a town, I have no explanations. I was in Sandy, Oregon, with my family during the weekend of July 21st to the 23rd, back in 2000. We were staying at the Sandy Inn, just west of the main part of town. It was hard to sleep at night of the 21st. It was very humid. There were some thunderstorms moving through at about midnight. I was up and down several times during the night, either to shut the window, open the window, turn on the AC, etc. I got up once, right around 3 or so in the morning, on the 22nd, after the storms had passed. I was sticking my head out of our second-story window, enjoying some cool air and kind of looking off into the woods toward the north. There was not a sound anywhere that I could hear. No cars on the highway, nothing. Then, I heard a very indescribable sound. I thought at first it was tires screeching, but as the seconds passed, I realized a car would have to be burning rubber for a long ways. Then, as I kind of cleared my head, I thought it sounded like a man screaming, or better yet, wailing. But I have never heard a human do a sound like that either. It was not a moan or a howling with an ooh sound. It was more like a yay sound, very high-pitched. It won't do me much good to try and interpret the sounds and the phonetics, but the way the pitch of the sound went up and down so fast, the way it modulated in pitch and tone, I have never heard any other animal or human make this sound. I've heard quite a lot of animals. If a human did what I'd heard, they'd bust their vocal cords. This went on for roughly 20 seconds, maybe a little longer, but not sure of that. It did seem to kind of trail off at one point and then come back. I know it was long enough for me to get a good listen, if not close by. The window faced toward the north, so it's possible that that's where it came from, but I can't be too sure of that. It seemed like it was off in the distance somewhere. When it started, it was rather quiet, and ended trailing off in the same manner as it started. Even though I was a bit groggy, it was weird enough to wake me up and even scare me a bit. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but the next morning, I was thinking to myself, what was that? I didn't report it or consider that until now. I wasn't sure, and after a while, I had honestly forgotten about it until something in my mind triggered it again. All I can say is if it was not a Bigfoot, fine, but please, tell me what it was. Near the end of August, this year, 2008, a couple of friends and I went camping / Bigfoot hunting around the upper Kallawash River in the Oregon Cascade Range east of the Estacada, with the intentions of finding a spot that I had been told about by a guide on a whitewater rafting trip. I had taken this back with my brother in 2006. Unfortunately, when we got to our destination, I was the only one in our group that wanted to look for Bigfoot. Disappointed, but not dissuaded, I tried to keep the rest of the group, 2 guys and 1 girl, at least someone interested in the Bigfoot search. To little avail. The first night we camped, under much protest, quite a way into the bush, and away from the overcrowded campgrounds, where everybody felt much more comfortable. We followed an old logging road until it ended at a very secluded stop, right on a ridge, maybe 350 yards, directly south of the clear-cut power lines running east and west. That first night was interesting. We continued to hear distinct wood-knocking sounds. They started up, right around 11 p.m. Most were far off and very fast. 4 to 7 quick, sharp cracks, directly east of us, echoing across the valley, only to be answered by another direction farther south and then north. But at first, they were pretty far off. Everybody thought they were gunshots, but this was a really dark night, and these sounds were coming from pretty deep in the thick forest, accessed only by not well-traveled logging roads from at least 3 different sources, and that, for the life of me, sounded like they were communicating. So, I ruled out gunshots. Now, these sounds continued to get closer to our campsite as the night wore on. At one point, maybe around 12:30 or 1 in the morning, the group wanted to drive over to the power lines, where the trees weren't so thick, and you could see for several miles. I, personally, decided to stay at camp and hope for something to happen. Almost immediately, after everybody else left, I began hearing sticks breaking from the direction they'd driven out on. Everything got really quiet. Now, I'm from Montana, and have spent many nights camping alone in a far more rugged terrain and mountains than I was in now. I've experienced most of the wildlife, at least partially, up close and personal, that our American forests have to offer. But I gotta tell you, I got a little spooked while they were gone. I did what any self-respecting outdoorsman would do, and put a lot more wood on the fire. I did not hear anything at the time. It sounded too bizarre, and I was glad when everybody got back. My buddy asked me if it was knocking rocks together while they were gone, although I told him I had not, and asked what they had heard. He said they were out looking at the valley from the top of the road we had came in on, about 250 to 350 yards away. They had all heard distinct knocking coming from the direction of our campsite. He claimed it sounded like a rock on rock. Later, after everybody had retired to their tents, I again decided to stay up. At around 3:30 a.m., I heard a very low grumble with a huff, followed by what sounded like a lot of breath being pushed out, very close to the fire, maybe 30 feet. It was dark brown or black, uniform in color, at least 9 feet tall, moving like a freight train. It was huge. We only saw it for maybe a second before it tore into the trees, running from right to left. My skeptical friend looked at me and said, "Did you see that?" I had my video camera in my lap, but there was no way that I could have gotten a shot of this thing. It was really moving. We stopped where we thought it crossed, and you could see quite clearly where something had come down the incline on the right side of the road. We didn't smell anything though, We got out, and I climbed the small incline that had come down to investigate. After 30 or so minutes, I found a barefoot track, 18 inches long and about 7.5 inches wide. I got video of it. I can send the video and have other stories of the area as well. We did have material with us to cast the print, but it was mossy on the ground, and so my buddy refused to cast it, claiming we wouldn't get anything from it. I was furious, but it was his stuff. I learned the hard way. Always pack your own gear. Okay, I'm 34, so what I'm about to tell you, I'm still having trouble accepting. I've wondered about this since I was little. Now, I know. August 25th, 2009. My girlfriend, her 2 boys, and I went camping at my usual spot. This location was picked due to the isolation factor. It's 10 miles up logging roads near Estacada, Oregon. I will not disclose the GPS coords, or even close to the proximity. This is my spot. Nothing abnormal occurred over the day or night of the 24th, and the day of the 25th was normal. Things like gathering wood for the coming night, all the normal things. We had put the boys down for the night, just after sundown. We were sitting around the fire, chatting and poking the fire. Being who I am, I began making a noise to hear it echo through the trees. You know, rooster noises and some whooping. Basic idiot noises. The time was approximately 11:30 p.m. I do this at times to keep bigger game from coming through camp. Well, I got one heck of a shock about 15 minutes later. We're walking back toward the fire from the truck. The fire was only bright glowing coals at this point. And boom, shock to the system. Out of the pitch black night, one of the most unreal sounds I have ever heard in my life came rushing through the dark. It was a hair-stiffening scream, and at that moment I could not match in my memory of noises over the 20 years I've been going into nature to escape. This was indeed the first time in my life that I felt the need to get out of nature, quickly. The sound pushed through the trees, like the trees were not even there. Even the air around us seemed to vibrate. From experience, I have had in the woods through my life, and tracking sounds and distance. I'm estimating that this scream was being produced about 200 yards away. It was so loud, nothing I knew of could make this big a noise. There's no animal I've come across that has lungs to produce such a loud, long, vocalized sound as this creature produced. Let me put it this way. If somebody told me they had heard it, I would be trying to put a canine responsible, but hearing it myself and knowing of nothing I've encountered can make that sound. Now, I did not stand there much longer. I think I may have pushed my girlfriend up into the truck so I could get in ASAP. As soon as I was in, the lights were on, the horn going for about 3 seconds to try and keep it from getting closer. It seemed to work. The volume began to fade a bit. We decided to get camp up and get out. Over the minutes it took us to completely tear down the camp, maintain a track on movement of the screams, and shove camp into the truck. The screaming continued and moved. From the time it started, it was about 2 o'clock from camp. While we were packing up, it moved clockwise around to about 5 o'clock. This all took about 30 minutes before we were on our way downhill. The screams continued even on our way out. To make it completely clear, I've done a lot in my life. Anything from solo hunting at the age of 12 up until my time in the military. I've never been spooked, even with rounds whizzing past. But that scared me to the point of every hair on the top of my toes to the top of my head were at attention. Now, after the fact, realizing what it was, yes, I'm going back there with recording gear. And let me tell you, after 34 years of just now experiencing what I did, has completely changed my thinking process while out here in the woods. The main river in this area and the surrounding county can be a double-edged sword. A vast wilderness, smacked up against a major population, Portland, Oregon, with numerous rock quarries used to create the logging roads. At times, the shooters make the canyons sound like a war zone. But as soon as playtime is over and evening sets in, people head back down the hill, and the war zone transforms into a more serene and mysterious place. Booms and blasts are a place with the sounds of winds blowing, birds chirping, and camp conversations. When night falls, another reality becomes very quickly apparent. This area has one of the highest instances of Sasquatch encounters in the entire country. Like many, I have reviewed much evidence online, from word of mouth, all the while wrestling with a degree of skepticism. This is not my first experience with this group leader, but it would prove to be my most memorable to date. We arrived at camp somewhere about 2:30 to 3 p.m., set up, and planned for the night's scouting. As the sun set and dusk turned to dark, the group leader gathered us all together. Having sized up the territory and considered several scenarios, he shared his thoughts about the night's approach. A particularly important point he mentioned was that it was vital to remain flexible and open to the possibility of modifying our plans if new evidence presented itself. So, the initial direction was decided and tactics clarified. He had selected an old closed road farther up the ridge, up against the beginning of the older growth, probably second growth timber. Access to the road had been blocked years before by a berm, impossible for cars, yet fairly easy to traverse on foot. It was roughly midnight as we crossed the berm into what can only be described, based on everybody's sudden change of mood, as somebody or something else's world. The wind had finally all but stopped, and it was now deathly quiet, except for the crunching of rocks under our boots. The brightness of the waxing moon lit the landscape, and our company in shadowy shades of black and gray, with silvery highlights. Our shadows were black and well-defined. One gentleman of our 5-man team, a young veteran of Middle East war, that proudly clad in his fatigues, walked point, followed by the group leader and his son. I was next, having made sure to place myself as close to the middle of the company as possible. And finally, the oldest man in our group picked up the rear of the column. I think that older gentleman understood the value of being last, increasing the chance of being selected for contact. The old road cut across a slope near the top of the ridge. Below, a steep drop-off, choked with new undergrowth, rhododendron, and an assortment of other lush Western Oregon varieties of undergrowth. Above us, a dark, shadowy strand of old trees, silvery snags strewn throughout the forest floor, the wild, most rugged terrain the area can offer. We approached a large dead tree that had fallen across the road, as each in the company climbed over the log, signaling yet another barrier into another world. The group leader stopped. He had been carrying a tree knocker, and now he would put it to good use. It was time to announce our presence. The group leader let loose with 2 sequences of knocks. Pop, pop, pop. Then, pop, pop. Each hit, echoing through the forest, rebounding off steep canyons with the force of a home run. We all had enough experience to stay completely quiet and wait for a possible response. No crunching boots, no wind, dead quiet. After a couple of moments, we moved on. The older gentleman was the first to hear a response, a soft tap-tap. He stopped the group for a listen. The first contact had been patrolling us from below, down the hill in the thick brush. We stopped and listened. Nothing, and then continued on. I began nervously glancing back down the road behind our column. I couldn't help but wonder if I might catch a brief glimpse of a dark figure slipping quietly across the road, back up into the timber. We then came to a bend in the road. There was a wide turnout, covered with ground cover. Our eyes had continued to adjust, so the moon now lit up our position on the landing, like a large streetlight. Just as my mind was focused on all of this, and when I least expected it, the real knocking began. At that moment, reality changed forever, and everybody was transformed. All eyes, all thoughts, all senses were now directed toward the dark timber. Not 50 feet away, the knocking continued. There, among the old trees, a shadowy figure, an intelligence controlling a hand with an opposable thumb, wielding possibly a large stick, sending knocking sounds echoing through the dark cathedral forest. The knocking pattern seemed to be a coded message, letting us know that whoever or whatever it was knew we were there. The army vet turned to me. I could still remember the excitement in his eyes as he exclaimed, "That's no woodpecker." And I replied, "This is real." I heard my name and quickly turned to see the rest of the group on the ground, the group leader quietly ordering me to get down. There, we sat as the group leader exchanged sounds and words with a creature that I now realized, for the first time in my life, was 100% real and just 50 feet away. Every one of us felt the rush of being fully alive and acutely present. During these moments, nothing else seemed to matter. I asked myself, can this really be happening? The group leader's words may not have been understood, but his calming tone must have spoken volumes to the figure or figures behind the tree line. We felt, as they must have, that neither was there to threaten the other. The knocks were not aggressive, simply a way to let us know they were there. Once the group leader thanked them for allowing us to share their space, he suggested that it might be time to retreat and not push things any further. We began hiking back toward the car. It soon became apparent our progress was now being flanked, and so it was. With glowing yellow-green and red eyes, vocalizations, and rustling all the way back to where we had parked. The following night would reveal further why we had been so closely monitored. Once back, we were abuzz. We realized that we had all just been transformed, born again. Nothing would ever be the same.